Hello, my dear friends. There were Victorian women who broke things just because the doctor stopped treatment. Some burst into tears in the middle of the clinic. Some wrote thank you letters several pages long, as if it were the greatest love of their lives. Orgasm was no longer a private matter. It became a way of healing, a need, something they waited for every week. They didn't say it, but they still invited each other to the clinic, still sat quietly waiting for their turn. A secret group was born. Wooden boxes hid their own equipment, and ink-soaked letters were passed around. Tonight, you will hear every real detail about how orgasm turned Victorian women into people who could no longer control themselves. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now I dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If there was one rule that defined Victorian womanhood, it was the absolute silence surrounding sexuality. From the moment a girl began her transition into adulthood, she was warned to guard her modesty, to hide her body, and to never speak of desire. Any suggestion that she might possess curiosity about herself was met with disapproval. A woman's value was measured not by her mind or health, but by her ability to embody chastity in every gesture. Yet in the same society that demanded this silence, doctors created an entirely new category of illness that gave them license to examine the very parts women were forbidden to acknowledge. That illness was called hysteria, and its reach was extraordinary. The diagnosis was so broad that it became a convenient explanation for almost anything. Women who fainted, women who complained of exhaustion, women who expressed irritability or dissatisfaction, all could be said to suffer from hysteria. Medical texts from the period list symptoms so varied that no clear definition could exist. One woman might be accused of hysteria for crying too much, another for refusing to smile. It is almost laughable that an entire medical discipline flourished by turning everyday emotions into evidence of female instability. The effect was that any form of discontent, no matter how justified, could be treated not as a social problem, but as a medical one. This approach allowed society to protect its own image. If a wife was unhappy, it was not the fault of her restrictive domestic role. If a daughter resisted an arranged marriage, her reluctance was not seen as reasoned but as a sickness. The diagnosis preserved the illusion that all was well with Victorian morality. Instead of admitting to the suffocating expectations placed on women, physicians reclassified that discomfort into a medical file. Families who wanted to avoid gossip accepted this language readily, because it gave them a way to discuss troubling behaviour without admitting failure. The word hysteria spread beyond medical offices. It became a social label whispered at gatherings or written between the lines of letters. A woman's reputation could suffer simply from being rumoured to have the condition, yet it was considered more respectable to be called hysterical than to be suspected of moral corruption. The diagnosis gave a thin cover, allowing women to receive some measure of care while still preserving the family's image. It is not unlike the way modern scandals are softened by euphemisms, as if words themselves can erase responsibility. The contradiction at the heart of this practice was striking. Women were forbidden from acknowledging sexuality, yet doctors openly examined them under the guise of medicine. Treatments demanded close attention to the body, even as women were expected to remain ignorant of how that body functioned. The silence of the home created the conditions for intrusion in the clinic. No one questioned it, because it was presented as a scientific necessity. In a world where even mentioning desire was scandalous, the medical encounter became a socially acceptable way to cross that boundary. Hysteria also reinforced the notion that women were naturally fragile. Doctors wrote about their patients as if weakness were an inherent part of being female. This belief justified not only medical intervention, but also the broader system of social control. Women were told they could not handle intellectual or political life because their nerves were too delicate. Their supposed instability required constant guidance, and the diagnosis of hysteria offered the perfect proof. Reading these records now, I find it deeply unsettling to imagine how many women were silenced, their feelings dismissed as nothing more than symptoms of a fictional disease. Families accepted the diagnosis because it explained what they did not want to see. A woman who was restless might actually be trapped in an unhappy marriage. A girl who cried at night might be overwhelmed by the pressures of social expectation. Instead of confronting those realities, relatives preferred to say she was hysterical. The word carried enough weight to discourage questions. It became easier to place blame on the woman's body than to admit the cruelty of her situation. Even death could be disguised under this language. Records often avoided naming diseases directly, preferring vague phrases like nervous decline or female weakness. This concealment preserved reputations but erased truth. Women died without their suffering acknowledged. Their stories reduced to polite entries in medical notes. To the outside world, the family remained respectable, untouched by scandal. The price of this respectability was silence, and silence allowed injustice to continue unchallenged. The popularity of the diagnosis grew so rapidly that it seemed almost universal. Middle-class families used it to maintain appearances, while physicians used it to secure their authority. Women themselves sometimes used it as a shield, because claiming hysteria could justify a retreat from exhausting duties. Yet what looked like protection was also confinement. To be hysterical was to be seen as unstable, incapable of independence, and forever in need of supervision. This cycle of suppression and medicalization reveals much about Victorian priorities. What mattered most was not truth or health, but the preservation of an image. By creating a condition that could mean anything, society found a way to explain away the unhappiness it had created. Women bore the burden, carrying both the symptoms and the blame. Hysteria was less a medical reality than a cultural tool, one that enforced silence even while pretending to offer care. The story of hysteria is therefore not just about doctors and patients. It is about a system that transformed suffering into evidence of weakness, that redefined resistance as illness, and that maintained order by rewriting pain into propriety. In this sense, hysteria was both a symptom and a strategy, reflecting the fear of what might happen if women were allowed to speak plainly. Women in Victorian society were expected to embody purity, and hysteria became the paradoxical confirmation that they were failing to do so. It explained away their discontent while reinforcing the standards that caused it. The more the term was used, the more it shaped reality, until silence itself became the defining feature of female health. Their voices were restrained, their pain repackaged, and their identities reduced to a diagnosis. The illusion of morality was preserved at all costs, even when it meant sacrificing truth. This was the foundation upon which stranger treatments would soon be justified. Victorian women lived under the shadow of purity, and hysteria became the convenient name for their silence. That silence served the needs of society, not their well-being. It disguised oppression as medicine, and turned ordinary emotions into evidence of disease. Their lives were shaped by silence, their struggles renamed as hysteria, and their dignity preserved only as an illusion. That illusion gave society comfort, but it prepared the ground for even more peculiar interventions. What doctors claimed as therapy would reveal just how far the boundary between science and desire could be stretched. Pelvic massage was introduced in Victorian medicine as a treatment so carefully disguised that it almost seemed respectable. Doctors described it as a remedy for nervous obstruction, a cure for the vague complaints that were all swept under the broad category of hysteria. In reality, it was intimate contact, performed under the authority of science, and its effects went far beyond the sterile explanations written in medical notes. The treatment required physicians to use their hands to stimulate the patient until a release was achieved, and this release was then recorded not as pleasure, but as a therapeutic biological reaction. By calling it medicine, society could look away from the obvious fact that women were experiencing what they were never allowed to admit: physical satisfaction. The language of these medical encounters was deliberately clinical. Physicians insisted that they had no emotional involvement, that they were simply applying a method proven to relieve symptoms. Women were told that what they felt was not immoral but restorative, not passion but physiology. It is almost amusing to think how far they went to pretend that the body could be separated from desire, as if labelling something treatment erased its nature. The contradiction was plain: a society that punished women for even mentioning sexuality simultaneously sent them to receive hands-on therapy under medical supervision. For many women, these appointments became a strange lifeline. They lived in homes where conversation about their bodies was forbidden, where even discomfort had to be hidden to preserve respectability. Yet in the quiet of the consulting room, they were given an experience that offered a kind of relief they could not name. Doctors wrote of muscle relaxation, of tension being released, of nerves being soothed. But what actually occurred was an orgasm. It was a word that could not be spoken in polite society, yet it was happening behind the closed doors of clinics and hospitals with astonishing regularity. Patients often returned for repeat treatments, and in many cases, physicians scheduled them as if they were routine checkups. A woman who came once might be advised to return weekly, or even more often if her symptoms persisted. The repetition created a pattern. Women began to rely on these sessions not just for the supposed cure, but for the unmistakable improvement in mood and energy afterward. It is not unlike modern people who return to the gym, the spa, or even therapy sessions, claiming health benefits while also seeking the emotional lift that comes from those rituals. The key difference was that these Victorian treatments carried an unspoken dimension of pleasure that no one dared to acknowledge. Doctors themselves faced difficulties. Some admitted privately or in medical correspondence that the procedure was exhausting. The manual stimulation required time and effort, and with a growing number of patients, their hands and patience were stretched thin. This led to experiments with mechanical devices that could assist or replace the physician's labour. But before those inventions, the reality was that countless women experienced release directly through their doctor's hands, written neatly in medical files as a purely physiological reaction. The reception among patients varied, but many women described feeling calmer, lighter, and more at ease in their daily lives after treatment. While they could not use the vocabulary of desire, they spoke of relief from heaviness, of better sleep, of a restored sense of self. These results only reinforced the popularity of pelvic massage as a cure for hysteria. Husbands, often unaware of the true nature of the treatment, accepted that their wives were under medical care, grateful that the sessions reduced irritability or melancholy in the household. The irony, of course, was that the improvement came not from tonics or sermons, but from something the culture strictly forbade in any other setting. There was an element of secrecy and complicity in the practice. Women rarely described the treatment outside of the medical room, and doctors cloaked it in heavy jargon to prevent scandal. To the outside world, it was a medical necessity. Inside, however, it was a ritual that blurred the boundary between medicine and intimacy. Some women may have understood this duality clearly, while others accepted the doctor's framing to protect themselves from shame. Either way, the outcome was the same: the female body experienced release, and the cycle of silence continued. What makes this chapter of history so striking is how society tolerated it. At the same time that sermons condemned female desire and magazines urged women to stay pure, the medical community institutionalized a practice that directly contradicted those messages. It thrived not because people were blind, but because the language of medicine provided a shield strong enough to preserve the illusion of morality. Families could send daughters and wives to the doctor without guilt, even as those visits provided what no husband or priest would openly permit: I find it unsettling to think about how many women discovered physical relief in clinics while remaining convinced that it was not their own desire, but merely their nerves being treated. This contradiction set the stage for profound changes in how women experience their own bodies. Though the treatment was framed as therapy, it introduced them to sensations and emotions they were never supposed to know. The very act of disguising orgasm as medicine revealed the deep hypocrisy of Victorian values. It also revealed how easily authority could manipulate language to normalize what would otherwise have been condemned. Women walked away from those appointments calmer, less troubled, and sometimes even transformed, but they could never speak openly of why. Victorian doctors claimed their hands were instruments of science, and their patients accepted that explanation. Behind those claims, however, was a reality that defied the strict boundaries of the age. The treatment was not simply a cure for hysteria. It was a gateway to experiences that society worked tirelessly to suppress. By reducing it to a biological reflex, they gave women permission to feel what they were forbidden to name. Women in the Victorian age entered clinics seeking help for vague complaints, and they left with bodies relieved and minds lifted. Doctors insisted it was medicine. Patients accepted it as treatment, and families were none the wiser. In this arrangement, silence was preserved, reputations were protected, and yet something entirely new was quietly taking place. The treatment of hysteria through pelvic massage reshaped how women understood relief, even if they could not call it pleasure. It was medicine by name, but something far more disruptive in practice. That disruption would soon demand new solutions, as the growing number of patients made manual methods unsustainable. The search for alternatives would open the door to devices that changed everything. In the Victorian medical world, orgasm was not considered an act of sexuality, but a carefully redefined medical event. Physicians went to great lengths to describe the release as a purely physiological response, free of moral meaning. They insisted that their role was detached, their emotions absent, and their actions purely professional. By reframing what was clearly an intimate experience as a sterile procedure, they created a system where women could undergo treatments that would have been unthinkable in any other context. This reframing not only protected doctors, but also gave women a shield against the accusations that might otherwise have destroyed their reputations. The patients themselves were instructed to view their reactions through the same lens. They were told that what happened on the examination table was not pleasure but therapy, not indulgence but correction. Doctors emphasized that it was no more shameful than having a tooth pulled or a wound stitched. It is almost absurd that an entire culture convinced women that physical ecstasy could be explained away as if it were no different than a sneeze. The logic was simple. If the experience could be categorized as medical, then it carried no moral stain. Yet the reality was far more complicated, because women were not immune to the emotions such experiences provoked. Inside the clinic, this illusion worked effectively. Women submitted to the procedures without speaking of desire, and doctors maintained their language of science. But outside, the boundaries shifted. What was acceptable in a medical office became dangerous if repeated in private. Women who touched themselves or sought satisfaction on their own risked condemnation. The act was considered immoral when claimed for personal use, yet it was entirely legitimate when supervised by a man in a white coat. The contradiction was enormous, but society accepted it because it reinforced the idea that women could only experience such things under authority. This framing created a strange paradox in female lives. They learned that their bodies could respond, that their nerves could release tension in a way that brought profound calm, but they were not permitted to claim ownership of that discovery. Instead, they were told that such responses were involuntary and meaningless, evidence not of pleasure but of illness being cured. It is not unlike how modern workplaces sometimes disguise leisure or comfort as productivity, repackaging enjoyment so that it seems acceptable only when serving a larger purpose. In both cases, human experience was controlled by how it was labelled. The insistence on purity extended even to medical records. Doctors documented each session with clinical detachment, noting the time, the symptoms, and the successful resolution of hysteria. Nowhere did they write the word pleasure. The records describe relaxation, reduced irritability, improved sleep, and restoration of balance. But between the lines, it is clear that these were euphemisms for something much more recognizable. Patients often left calmer, even joyful, but the language of medicine ensured that their joy could not be acknowledged as such. For the women themselves, the situation was deeply conflicted. On the one hand, they were reassured that nothing shameful had happened. On the other hand, their bodies told them that what they felt was powerful, undeniable, and unlike anything they were taught to expect from marriage or duty. Some accepted the medical explanation gratefully, because it allowed them to preserve their sense of respectability. Others, quietly and perhaps guiltily, recognized that there was more happening than anyone dared to admit. I cannot help but feel sympathy for those women, torn between the relief they discovered and the guilt pressed upon them by the society around them. This contradiction exposed a deeper truth. Victorian morality was less about protecting virtue than about controlling context. A woman's body could be touched, aroused, and released, as long as it was done under the sanctioned cover of science. The same act, when performed by herself, was condemned as perversion. By drawing these arbitrary lines, the culture ensured that women never gained independence over their own sexuality. Even their most personal experiences were filtered through the authority of others. Husbands rarely questioned this arrangement. If their wives were calmer after treatments, they accepted it as a medical success. Few considered what the therapy truly entailed, and fewer still wanted to confront the possibility that doctors were offering what they themselves either could not or would not provide. To admit such a reality would have challenged the foundation of male authority. So the silence persisted, reinforced by both ignorance and denial. The normalization of medical orgasm also prevented broader conversations about female desire. Because the experience was labeled as treatment, it could not be connected to discussions of sexuality or equality. It remained hidden, confined to the clinical space, stripped of any power to change how society viewed women. This limitation ensured that while women could benefit individually, the system that oppressed them continued unchanged. The very framework that gave them relief also kept them captive. The paradox of Victorian medicine was that it gave women a taste of liberation while denying them the language to describe it. They could feel, but not name. They could experience, but not claim. By controlling words, society controlled reality. What might have been the beginning of the acknowledgement became instead a reinforcement of silence. Women were told that their experiences belonged not to them but to science, and that their bodies spoke only in symptoms, not in desires. The culture of the age prided itself on rationality and restraint, but its medical practices revealed something else entirely. Beneath the polished surface of morality was a system built on contradiction, where women could be both forbidden and indulged, silent and expressive, oppressed and comforted, all within the same breath. Orgasm, in this context, was stripped of its human meaning and remade as a sterile reaction, safe to acknowledge only in the shadow of authority. Victorian women were thus caught in a cycle of denial and discovery. Their bodies betrayed truths that society refused to recognize, and doctors transformed those truths into a form of therapy. In this carefully constructed illusion, everyone could pretend that purity remained intact. Yet the illusion was fragile, and the demand for treatment only grew stronger. Women were told that orgasm was medicine, not desire, and they learned to repeat that lesson to themselves. It offered safety, but it also reinforced control. The system thrived precisely because it disguised rebellion as obedience. The more women sought the therapy, the more society convinced itself that morality had been preserved. Orgasm was accepted in the Victorian clinic because it wore the mask of science. That mask allowed women to experience what they were otherwise denied, and it allowed men to maintain their authority. But with each session, The line between treatment and indulgence blurred further, and the illusion became harder to sustain. The strain of maintaining that boundary would soon reveal itself in unexpected ways. As the demand for these therapies grew beyond what doctors could easily manage, the popularity of hysteria treatments grew so rapidly that demand soon surpassed all expectations. Women who once visited their doctors occasionally began arranging appointments on a regular basis, sometimes several times a week. Each treatment brought relief, and with relief came the subtle recognition that life felt unbearable without it. What had been framed as a medical solution became, in practice, something that patients could not live without. Doctors recorded improvements in mood and energy, but they also noted a troubling trend: women who skipped their treatments often returned more distressed than before. What began as therapy was quietly evolving into dependence. This dependence carried a weight that families could not ignore. Women who had once been described as delicate but manageable became restless if denied access to the clinic. They reported sleeplessness, anxiety, and sudden bursts of irritability when their schedules were interrupted. The irony was that the very treatment designed to restore order created a need that disrupted households even more. It is almost darkly humorous to imagine Victorian doctors congratulating themselves for curing hysteria, while at the same time producing patients desperate to come back. Husbands tolerated the expense because they saw temporary improvements, but they grew uneasy as visits multiplied. Some suspected exaggeration, but few dared to question the authority of medicine. As weeks turned into months, the cycle deepened. Patients began to invent reasons to return for therapy, describing vague symptoms that could not be disproved. A headache, a restless night, or even a feeling of heaviness became justification for another appointment. The physicians, bound by their own definitions, rarely refused. Every complaint could be interpreted as evidence of hysteria, and every cure required the same method. The more common the practice became, the harder it was to separate genuine need from eager expectation. Some women confessed, indirectly, to feeling worse between treatments than they had before beginning them. They described emptiness, irritability, or unexplained sadness when too much time had passed. Families noticed changes in temperament, marking their wives or daughters as unpredictable if the therapy was delayed. The release that once calmed them now seemed to expose a deeper hunger. It reminds me of modern cases where people grow dependent on wellness rituals, supplements, or therapies, insisting they cannot function without routines that once felt optional. What began as a remedy for vague distress became a necessity, and necessity quickly turned into obsession. Doctors themselves noticed the intensity of these attachments. Some complained that their waiting rooms were filled with repeat patients demanding appointments more frequently than could be managed. Physicians who prided themselves on professionalism faced accusations of favoritism or impropriety when patients grew too attached. Medical journals of the period reveal subtle discomfort, the fear that hysteria treatment, rather than curing women, was creating a new category of disorder. For patients, the stakes were even higher. To miss a session was to risk emotional collapse. Some women became so unstable between treatments that families feared for their mental health. Reports circulated of women sinking into depression, refusing food, or falling into uncontrollable fits when they were denied access to therapy. The line between medical necessity and psychological craving blurred, leaving observers unsettled. I cannot help but think how terrifying it must have been for these women, caught between a society that denied their desires and a medical system that fed them in secret but never admitted the truth. When a doctor retired, moved away, or became ill, the consequences could be catastrophic for his patients. Women accustomed to regular therapy often experienced complete breakdowns when suddenly deprived of it. Some were described as inconsolable, weeping for days, or lashing out in anger. In certain cases, families admitted them to institutions, claiming their hysteria had grown uncontrollable. Yet behind those walls, the truth was less about disease and more about withdrawal from what had become an essential ritual of their lives. This dependence revealed the dangerous power of redefining pleasure as medicine. By stripping the experience of its true name, doctors had convinced women that their relief was purely therapeutic, but their bodies knew otherwise. Each treatment reinforced a connection between release and survival. The result was a generation of women who associated calmness, stability, and even sanity with regular visits to the doctor's office. Once that connection was made, it was nearly impossible to sever. Husbands and families faced their own dilemmas. Some viewed their wives' frequent visits with suspicion, wondering whether the therapy was masking something inappropriate. Others dismissed concerns, preferring to believe the medical explanation rather than confront unsettling alternatives. The silence of Victorian propriety ensured that few ever spoke openly about what these treatments entailed. By refusing to name it, society allowed the cycle of dependence to grow unchecked. The women themselves bore the heaviest burden. They were trapped in a system where their only access to relief came through methods they could not admit to desiring. They learned to disguise their longing as illness, to couch their need in medical language, and to plead for therapy without revealing the truth. What society called hysteria was in many ways the expression of their own suppressed humanity, but it was hidden under layers of shame and silence. The paradox became too large to ignore. Doctors complained of overwork, families worried about reputations, and patients spiraled when deprived of access. Yet the system persisted, because no one dared to challenge its foundations. To admit the truth would have meant acknowledging female desire, and that was something Victorian culture could not allow. Women grew increasingly dependent on therapy framed as medicine, and that dependency often spiraled into crisis when interrupted. Families concealed breakdowns, physicians avoided uncomfortable admissions, and society maintained the illusion that everything remained under control. In reality, control was slipping, and the consequences were becoming more visible. The illusion of therapy had produced something far closer to obsession, one that neither doctors nor patients could fully manage. Women found themselves unable to stop returning, and doctors could not bring themselves to refuse. The more treatments they received, the less stable they became without them. It was a cycle that revealed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of Victorian medicine, where control was preached but dependency quietly flourished. That dependency, however, also drove innovation, as the growing demand pushed doctors to seek new ways to provide the therapy without exhausting themselves. The strain of performing pelvic massage by hand soon became too much for many Victorian physicians. They complained in private that the procedure was time-consuming, physically exhausting, and impossible to maintain with the growing number of patients demanding regular treatment. The search for alternatives was inevitable, and it led to the development of mechanical devices that promised to deliver the same results with less effort. These tools began as crude contraptions powered by water or electricity, yet their purpose was disguised under the language of medicine. To the outside world, they were simply instruments for restoring balance to nervous systems. To the women who used them, they quickly became something far more significant. The first of these devices was water-based. By directing a strong stream of water toward the body, physicians found they could replicate the effects of manual therapy without tiring themselves. Hospitals installed special equipment in private rooms, marketed as hydrotherapy, with no mention of the sensations it created. Patients were told the rushing water stimulated circulation and relieved congestion. What it also provided was a form of release that many women described, in coded terms, as invigorating or calming beyond expectation. It is almost laughable how Victorian medicine managed to transform a fountain into an official cure for hysteria, as though plumbing had suddenly become a therapeutic breakthrough. As electricity became more common, inventors seized on its potential. Early vibratory machines were large, noisy, and awkward to operate. They required cranks, pulleys, or electrical currents that filled the room with sound and motion. Despite their size, these machines worked more quickly than manual methods, allowing doctors to treat more patients in less time. Some models were installed in clinics, while others were portable enough to be carried from house to house. Advertisements avoided explicit references, describing them as general tonics for the nerves, but physicians and patients alike understood what they were truly designed to accomplish. The presence of machines in medical offices had a secondary effect. It lent an even greater sense of legitimacy to the practice. Where the human hand could be questioned, the machine appeared impersonal, a tool of science rather than an extension of flesh. Women who might have felt embarrassed at prolonged manual sessions often found comfort in the neutrality of a device. They could tell themselves that the machine was simply an instrument, no more intimate than a stethoscope or thermometer. This fiction made the treatment more acceptable, even as it spread the practice further. For wealthy women, the next step was obvious. Why depend entirely on the doctor when similar devices could be obtained for private use? Some purchased smaller versions designed for the home, marketed in discreet catalogues, or recommended quietly by sympathetic physicians. These machines, though still bulky by modern standards, allowed women to experience relief on their own schedules. Families with means could install water therapy systems or buy electrical models, treating them as respectable household equipment. It is not unlike the way modern homes fill with fitness machines or wellness gadgets, purchased under the banner of health, but often serving much more personal needs. The popularity of these devices reflected the scale of demand. Once women discovered the benefits of treatment, they sought ways to access it more frequently and with less dependency on busy physicians. Private ownership offered freedom, but it also deepened the secrecy. While doctors could at least claim medical authority, women who used machines in their homes had to maintain even greater silence. Servants were expected not to question, husbands were told vague explanations, and the subject was never raised outside the household. Respectability was preserved by pretending the machines were nothing more than standard health appliances. Medical journals of the period often reviewed these devices with enthusiasm, praising their efficiency and their contribution to managing hysteria. They described the relief of symptoms, the improved temperaments of patients, and the reduction of strain on practitioners. What they avoided, carefully, was acknowledging what these machines actually produced. The word orgasm never appeared in print. Instead, writers described outcomes as resolution, release of congestion, or restoration of equilibrium. The avoidance of truth was so consistent that generations of readers could study the literature without realizing what was hidden between the lines. Women who used these devices often kept private notes or letters, recording their experiences in language that balanced between medical respectability and personal discovery. They described feeling renewed, calm, or strangely alive. Some confessed to feeling guilty afterward, uncertain whether they had crossed a line. Others expressed gratitude that such treatments existed at all, believing them to be the only thing keeping them sane in a world that offered so few outlets for their frustrations. I find it striking that what was called progress in medicine was, for many women, the first genuine encounter with their own bodily autonomy. The spread of machines also shifted the balance of power in subtle ways. Doctors remained gatekeepers for many women, but the possibility of private use introduced an element of independence. For the first time, women could access relief without needing an appointment, without seeking permission, and without explanation. This independence, though fragile, hinted at a change far larger than medicine intended. By disguising devices of pleasure as medical tools, society had unwittingly given women access to a resource that challenged the very structures meant to confine them. Yet the secrecy surrounding these devices never lessened. The cultural silence demanded that their true purpose remain unspoken. Families maintained appearances, physicians preserved reputations, and women concealed their private rituals. The paradox grew deeper. Victorian society condemned any open discussion of female desire, while at the same time filling homes and clinics with machines designed to stimulate it. The contradiction was too obvious to ignore, but ignoring it was precisely what the culture demanded. What began as a solution to physician fatigue evolved into a phenomenon that reached far beyond the clinic. Machines multiplied, ownership expanded, and the rituals of treatment became embedded in daily life for many women. Beneath the surface of propriety, an entire subculture of hidden practice thrived, powered by electricity, water, and silence. Doctors, patients, and inventors all contributed to this development, whether through intention or denial. The result was a world where medical devices quietly delivered what morality forbade, and where women discovered in secret what society insisted they could never seek. Respectability was preserved, but at a cost the truth of what these machines provided could never be admitted. Victorian physicians turned to machines out of necessity, but those machines gave women more than relief from symptoms. They offered control, access, and independence, even if only in the shadows. The silence of society allowed the paradox to survive, but the growing popularity of mechanical therapy ensured that it could not be contained forever. Women had begun to take their treatment into their own hands, quite literally, and with each new device, the illusion of control slipped further away. That quiet revolution, born of exhaustion and disguised as medicine, was only the beginning. The rise of specialized institutions would take this hidden practice to an entirely new scale, one that resembled something more like a retreat than a doctor's office. In the quieter edges of Victorian cities, far from the crowded streets and respectable townhouses, new institutions began to appear. These were not hospitals in the ordinary sense, nor were they places openly advertised as havens of pleasure. They were established as nursing homes or sanitaria for women diagnosed with hysteria, and their number grew steadily as demand increased. Families who could afford the fees sent wives, daughters, or sisters to these retreats with the belief that extended care would restore balance to their fragile nerves. What they often discovered, though rarely acknowledged, was that these institutions functioned less like hospitals and more like hidden spas devoted to a very particular form of treatment. The daily routines in these places followed a familiar structure. Women arrived with letters of referral from physicians, complaining of nervous exhaustion, sleeplessness, or persistent melancholy. Upon admission, they were given private rooms, meals designed for convalescence, and access to gardens or drawing rooms where rest was encouraged. But the centerpiece of their stay was always the same therapy sessions that concluded with the so-called pelvic relaxation treatment. Each patient underwent this ritual regularly, sometimes multiple times during a week-long stay. The procedure was framed in medical terms, but the relief it provided was understood, even if never spoken aloud. It is almost ridiculous to imagine a culture that condemned female pleasure, creating entire institutions where it was scheduled as part of the daily routine. The atmosphere of these nursing homes was carefully cultivated to resemble gentility rather than scandal. Interiors were decorated with heavy curtains, polished wood, and tasteful furnishings that suggested respectability. Staff were trained to behave with quiet professionalism, maintaining the appearance of a proper medical environment. Visitors might see women reclining with books, sipping restorative tonics, or strolling through gardens, never suspecting that the true heart of the establishment lay behind closed treatment room doors. The design of the space itself helped sustain the illusion, ensuring that patients could move between worlds without openly confronting the contradiction. For the women admitted, these institutions offered more than physical relief. They represented a temporary escape from the relentless roles of wife, mother, and daughter. In a society where domestic duty was constant, the chance to be treated as a patient brought unexpected freedom. Days were structured around rest, care, and attention, rather than chores or obligations. In this way, the institutions functioned as sanctuaries where women were allowed to set aside the expectations of their families. It is not unlike the modern idea of luxury retreats, where people justify indulgence by framing it as wellness or self-care. The language changes, but the impulse is strikingly similar. These retreats also fostered a sense of community among patients. Women who might never have spoken openly in their homes found themselves surrounded by others undergoing the same rituals. Although the topic was rarely discussed explicitly, a quiet recognition passed between them. They understood that their relief was shared, that their experiences were not unique, and that within the walls of these institutions, the rules of propriety loosened ever so slightly. The silence remained, but it was a silence tinged with solidarity. Doctors overseeing these facilities emphasized the importance of long-term care. They argued that short visits to clinics were insufficient for chronic cases of hysteria, and that only prolonged treatment could truly restore health. This argument conveniently supported the financial model of the institutions, which relied on extended stays. Families, anxious to see improvement, paid the fees and asked a few questions. Husbands were particularly eager to endorse the arrangement, relieved that their wives returned calmer, more compliant, and temporarily freed of the irritability that had unsettled households. The reality, of course, was that these women were being given access to something society denied them elsewhere. The reputation of these nursing homes varied. Some were spoken of in respectable tones, recommended by physicians as ideal environments for recovery. Others gained whispers of suspicion, their names exchanged in half-muttered conversations. Still, few dared to confront the truth directly. To do so would have meant acknowledging what the therapy truly entailed, and that acknowledgement threatened the entire structure of Victorian morality. By allowing the silence to continue, society preserved both its illusions and its institutions. For the women inside, however, the impact was deeply personal. They discovered that their mood stabilized, their energy returned, and their sense of self sharpened during their stays. They attributed this to the careful routines, the quiet, or the attention of staff. But beneath those justifications lay the undeniable fact of their treatments. Some carried the memory of these experiences with them long after leaving, longing for the relief that only the institution could provide. Others returned again and again, making residency almost a seasonal habit. The expansion of these facilities reflected the scale of demand. In many cities, entire suburbs developed reputations for housing retreats for women, much like seaside resorts or spa towns. The clientele was almost exclusively female, drawn from families that could afford to pay for discretion. Behind their respectable facades, these institutions thrived, their success built on a blend of denial and indulgence. They stood as monuments to a society that refused to speak the truth, yet built entire industries upon it. For doctors, the existence of such places offered both convenience and authority. They could refer patients to facilities where treatments would continue without straining their own schedules. For families, the homes promised relief from the disruption of living with a restless or distressed woman. And for the women themselves, they offered a rare kind of liberation, one that came not from words or declarations, but from the quiet, repetitive rituals carried out in treatment rooms. I find it haunting to consider how these institutions gave women moments of freedom under the pretense of illness, freedom they could not claim openly in their own lives. The growth of these nursing homes signalled a shift in the balance of Victorian society. What began as an isolated clinical practice had expanded into a network of hidden sanctuaries, disguised as medical care but functioning as escapes. Women entered with the language of sickness, but what they found was a temporary taste of autonomy, however veiled. The contradiction was never resolved, only sustained by silence. Victorian society prided itself on order and morality, yet it built retreats where women quietly discovered relief forbidden elsewhere. The more these institutions multiplied, the clearer it became that hysteria was not an illness at all, but a symptom of a culture unable to accept female humanity. Families pretended, doctors documented, and patients endured, all under the cover of a polite lie. Women were admitted to institutions for hysteria, treated with routine therapies, and returned to their homes calmer but never freer. The homes gave them temporary escape, but they also deepened their dependence on silence. This growing system of hidden sanctuaries revealed both the hypocrisy of Victorian values and the power of need, and as the demand continued to rise, even the confines of these retreats would not be enough to contain the paradox. In grand Victorian households, where appearances were everything and discretion was a form of currency, the practice of hysteria treatment soon extended beyond the clinic walls. Wealthy women who grew accustomed to regular therapy sessions often faced the dilemma of what to do when a physician was not available. The solution, in some homes, was both practical and unsettling. Household servants were trained to administer the treatment in place of the doctor. What began as a medical service within institutions seeped into private life, turning bedrooms and drawing rooms into makeshift consulting spaces. The silence of the age ensured that no one outside the household was ever meant to know. The process of instruction was often subtle. A mistress would return from the clinic calmer, more composed, and eventually she would decide that the results could not wait until her next appointment. Servants, already bound by duty and loyalty, became unwilling participants in this intimate arrangement. They were ordered to follow exact instructions, told where to apply pressure, and how to recognize when the treatment was complete. It is almost absurd to think of etiquette manuals telling servants how to pour tea with precision, while behind closed doors, they were being shown how to replicate medical intimacy. For the mistress, it was simply continuity of care. For the servant, it was a command they had no power to refuse. The secrecy surrounding these practices was absolute. A servant who spoke even a word of what occurred risked immediate dismissal and permanent damage to their reputation. Many were reminded that their livelihoods, and often the survival of their families, depended on obedience. The imbalance of power was overwhelming. A wealthy woman could demand silence and receive it, because the consequences for breaking trust were too severe. Servants became keepers of their mistress's hidden rituals, carrying knowledge they could never reveal. Some accounts suggest that servants described their experiences in private letters or testimonies, revealing feelings of unease and even horror at what they were compelled to do. For them, this was not medicine but humiliation, a violation of boundaries masked as duty. Yet they endured, because endurance was the condition of their class. It is not unlike the modern reality of employees who are forced to perform uncomfortable tasks under the guise of professionalism, swallowing their discomfort to keep their jobs. The Victorian household magnified this reality, embedding it in daily life where the divide between servant and mistress was both intimate and unbridgeable. For the women who instructed their staff, the situation was framed very differently. They convinced themselves that the treatment was purely medical, that their instructions were clinical rather than personal. They reassured themselves that servants were simply carrying out another form of care, no different from dressing wounds or managing baths. But the truth lingered beneath the surface. These were acts of profound intimacy, shifted into domestic service because propriety demanded silence. By maintaining the illusion of therapy, mistresses protected themselves from shame, while their servants bore the unspoken cost. The domestic arrangement of treatment highlighted the contradictions of Victorian morality. On one hand, society proclaimed the sanctity of female purity and the dignity of respectable homes. On the other hand, those same homes contained hidden practices that blurred every boundary between medicine, desire, and coercion. The servants who carried out these tasks became invisible participants in the larger hypocrisy, silenced not by choice, but by necessity. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine how many households quietly sustained this contradiction, with lives divided between the rituals of public respectability and the secrets of private treatment. This practice also reinforced the idea that women of privilege could bend rules in ways that poorer women could not. A wealthy lady could transform her hysteria treatment into a private ritual, confident that her servants would comply. A woman of lower means, without servants or funds for devices, had no such options. her dependence on doctors remained absolute, or her suffering remained untreated. Thus, even in matters of hidden pleasure and disguised therapy, class divisions determined who had access, who held control, and who bore the burden. The involvement of servants also ensured that the culture of silence extended downward. Entire households became complicit in the charade, with multiple people aware of rituals no one dared to speak of. Servants who prepared treatment rooms, cleaned equipment, or assisted their mistresses carried fragments of knowledge, all bound together by fear of exposure. Respectability was preserved because everyone, from the mistress to the lowest maid, had something to lose if the truth escaped. In the broader context of Victorian society, this domestic extension of hysteria treatment illustrates how deeply the illusion of morality was woven into everyday life. Clinics and hospitals may have appeared to be the primary spaces of therapy, but in reality, the practice seeped into parlours and bedrooms, transforming private homes into hidden extensions of the medical world. The line between physician and servant, treatment and service, blurred until the distinctions no longer mattered. For the women who relied on their servants, the therapy provided not only relief, but also a sense of control. They had brought the authority of medicine into their own homes, reshaped it to fit their daily schedules, and concealed it within the walls of propriety. For the servants, it was yet another task demanded in a world where their own boundaries held no weight. This hidden layer of Victorian domestic life reveals not only the persistence of silence, but also the unequal costs of sustaining it. Mistresses instructed, servants obeyed, and households carried secrets too heavy to speak. The illusion of medical necessity allowed everything to continue, but beneath it lay the unsettling truth of coerced intimacy and unspoken dependence. The story of hysteria treatment was never just about doctors and patients. It was also about the homes that quietly became theatres for practices no one dared admit. Women brought hysteria treatments into their houses, trained their servants to perform them, and lived as if nothing unusual had occurred. Servants submitted, endured, and kept the silence, for to do otherwise meant ruin. It was another layer in the great Victorian hypocrisy, another example of how purity on the surface concealed practices no one wanted to see. And as this hidden system expanded, it laid the foundation for an even stranger phenomenon, one where the rituals of therapy grew into something resembling faith itself. The spread of hysterical treatments eventually gave rise to something larger than medicine. Women no longer viewed the sessions only as remedies for nervous complaints, or as therapies prescribed by physicians. They began to see them as essential rituals, repeated with the regularity of religious observances. In a world that demanded their silence and submission, the brief moments of release felt like proof that they were still alive. These women were not addicted to their doctors, nor even to the idea of sexuality as it might have been defined in other contexts. What they became attached to was the fleeting sensation of existence itself, the sharp reminder that beneath all the layers of duty and restraint, their bodies still belonged to them. The ritual nature of these treatments cannot be overstated. Women arranged their schedules around appointments, sometimes planning social visits, household tasks, and even travel with the therapy in mind. For many, it became the one event they anticipated with eagerness, a secret highlight in lives otherwise marked by monotony and duty. It is almost grimly funny to imagine Victorian households carefully managing propriety, while their mistresses prepared with equal care for what was essentially a private religious service of the flesh. The irony was that the more society suppressed open acknowledgement of female desire, the more powerful the hidden rituals became. In these quiet sessions, women found what sermons and moral codes denied them a sense of personal liberation. The explosion of feeling that followed treatment was not described in the language of lust, but in terms of relief, freedom, and clarity. Patients wrote in private diaries of feeling whole, of feeling balanced, of feeling human again. The very vagueness of the medical vocabulary allowed them to translate what they felt into words that could be tolerated in their society. Yet behind those words lay something much closer to devotion. This devotion mirrored the intensity of religious faith. Women spoke of the treatments as though they were sacraments, necessary for the preservation of sanity and dignity. Some described a kind of transformation afterward, a lightness of spirit, or a sudden calm that carried them through the demands of family life. They approached their doctors not as lovers, but as priests of an unspoken creed, guiding them through rituals that cleansed and renewed. It is not unlike the way modern people speak of yoga retreats or meditation practices, framing them as wellness traditions but often investing them with a near spiritual sense of salvation. The terminology changes, but the pattern of devotion remains recognizable. The psychological effects of this attachment were profound. Women who might otherwise have sunk into despair discovered a lifeline in their treatments. They learned to endure suffocating marriages, oppressive domestic duties, and stifling expectations by clinging to the promise of their next session. The brief eruption of sensation reminded them that they were not entirely erased by their roles. For a moment, they were more than wives, more than mothers, more than ornaments of propriety. They were individuals with bodies that responded, that demanded recognition, that refused to be silenced completely. Doctors often encouraged this devotion, though without admitting its true cause. They spoke of the importance of regular sessions for maintaining equilibrium, recommending schedules that resembled the calendar of religious observances. Weekly or bi-weekly appointments became standard for many women, and for chronic cases, even daily treatments were suggested. The more the routine was emphasized, the more women relied upon it. The cycle fed itself, turning medical procedure into something approaching ritual dependence. This dependence carried dangers as well as relief. Women began to feel unstable when treatments were delayed, restless when their schedules were interrupted, and despondent if their doctors became unavailable. Their lives revolved around the promise of release to the point that it overshadowed other sources of comfort or meaning. I cannot help but think of how heartbreaking it must have been to tie one's entire sense of vitality to a practice that could never be openly acknowledged, that always had to be cloaked in shame and silence. The fragility of this arrangement was immense, yet it endured because society offered no alternative. In the private writings that survive, this attachment appears again and again. Some women recorded their gratitude for physicians, not in romantic language, but in terms that bordered on reverence. Others described the feeling of emptiness when treatments were interrupted, using words that echo the descriptions of spiritual longing in religious texts. Their bodies became temples, and the therapy became the ritual through which they were reminded of their own humanity. It was an act of survival, but it was also an act of devotion to something beyond the reach of Victorian morality. Husbands, largely ignorant of the true nature of the practice, sometimes noticed the intensity of their wives' anticipation. They saw the improvement afterward, but they rarely understood the depth of attachment. For them, it was enough that their households ran more smoothly, that irritability and melancholy seemed less disruptive. The possibility that their wives were experiencing something akin to spiritual rebirth in another man's office was too unsettling to consider. Silence protected them from the truth, just as it protected the women from shame. The culture that produced this phenomenon remained blind to its implications. By refusing to recognize female desire openly, Victorian society forced it underground, where it took on the qualities of faith. Women did not worship their doctors, nor even the treatments themselves, but the moment of existence that the treatments gave them. They worshipped the fleeting awareness that they were alive, that they were more than the roles imposed upon them. This form of devotion was invisible to the world, but it shaped the inner lives of countless women. The addiction was not to men, nor to the idea of sexuality, but to survival itself. In the absence of other outlets, the ritual of treatment became the only place where life felt tangible. The irony was crushing a culture that celebrated morality above all else. inadvertently created a system where hidden rituals of release became the closest thing many women had to freedom. Victorian women turned their medical treatments into private rites of existence, repeated with the fervour of devotion. They found in them the one place where silence was broken, not in words but in sensations. It was a fragile devotion, one that could collapse the moment treatments were denied, and when denial did come, it revealed just how perilously close many women were to despair. Victorian women who sought treatment for hysteria found themselves caught in an endless conflict between shame and anticipation. Each visit to the doctor provided relief, a fleeting sense of being alive. But the moment it ended, guilt crept in. They had been taught since girlhood that modesty was their highest virtue, that the body was not to be acknowledged, and that desire was unthinkable. Yet the treatments forced them to face sensations that morality told them they should never know. The contradiction was overwhelming. They left the consulting room calmer, even restored, but with a lingering unease that they had crossed a line, even if the line was invisible and unspoken. The secrecy of these visits was absolute. Wives did not tell their husbands the true nature of their therapy. Mothers hid it from their children, and women concealed it from their friends. Officially, they were seeking care for fragile health, nervous exhaustion, or recurring illness. In reality, they were participating in rituals of release that could never be named. It is almost comical to imagine respectable Victorian women rehearsing excuses about headaches or faintness, while carefully arranging weekly appointments for something so obviously more than medicine. This constant concealment was as exhausting as the illness it was meant to cure, for it forced women to live two lives, one of purity in public and another of secret dependence in private. The paradox was sharpened by what followed each session. For a brief time, women felt lighter, steadier, and more able to face the demands of home, but the relief carried with it a heavy shadow of guilt. They were told it was medical, yet their bodies insisted otherwise. Some admitted in diaries that they felt as though they were deceiving themselves, clinging to the doctor's language because it was the only way to protect their reputations. Others turned the guilt inward, punishing themselves with thoughts of sin and weakness. The very practice that restored their balance also threatened their sense of morality. This cycle created a strange rhythm. A woman might leave the doctor's office with her conscience troubled, but before long, she began to feel the weight of her nerves again. The anticipation of the next treatment overshadowed her guilt, pulling her back into the same loop. Shame was forgotten when the need became too strong, only to return the moment relief was found. It is not unlike modern patterns of behaviour where people condemn themselves for indulgence, yet cannot resist repeating it, an endless spiral of guilt and craving. The difference was that in Victorian times, the indulgence was cloaked in respectability, even as it devoured the spirit. Some women grew so entangled in this rhythm that they began scheduling new appointments before even leaving the clinic. They felt trapped, unable to resist planning for the next encounter, even as they reproached themselves for what had just occurred. The doctor's reassurance that it was only medicine helped, but it did not erase the unease. At home, they returned to lives defined by duty and silence, knowing that their bodies carried a secret their families could never be allowed to guess. The psychological toll of this contradiction was immense. Women began to see themselves as unstable, not because of the illness, but because of the emotional turmoil surrounding its cure. They oscillated between relief and self-reproach, caught in a loop that seemed endless. This inner conflict eroded their confidence, convincing them that they were weak, guilty, or broken. Families noticed only that treatments made them calmer, never realizing the hidden storm that followed. I cannot help but feel sorrow for those women, burdened not only by the repression of their society, but also by the crushing weight of shame imposed upon their most private experiences. The moral structure of the time ensured that no resolution was possible. To speak openly of what they felt was impossible. To abandon treatment was equally unthinkable, for the suffering without it was unbearable. Thus, they lived suspended between two realities, respectable wives and mothers on the surface, conflicted patients in secret. The strain wore on their minds as much as their bodies, creating a perpetual state of anxiety. Doctors did little to ease this conflict. Their clinical language reinforced the illusion, but they offered no comfort for the shame. By refusing to acknowledge the full nature of the treatments, they left their patients alone with their guilt. The silence that protected society also condemned women to solitude in their moral struggles. They learned to endure, as they endured so much else, by burying their feelings beneath layers of obedience and pretense. The result was a generation of women whose lives were defined by contradictions they could not resolve. Their morality told them they were failing, their bodies told them they were alive, and their doctors told them nothing at all. The illusion of therapy preserved their reputations, but it did not preserve their peace of mind. The shame followed them, lingering like a shadow that darkened even the brightest moments of relief. Women concealed their visits, endured their guilt, and returned again and again to the cycle of secrecy and dependence. Their lives became a continuous loop of indulgence and denial, a contradiction sustained by silence. It was a loop that served the needs of society, but it tore at the souls of those trapped within it. And as the cycle deepened, it began to undermine something else: the authority of men who believed themselves firmly in control of their households. Victorian men lived with the confidence that their authority was unquestioned, both in their households and in society at large. Husbands viewed themselves as guardians of morality, protectors of fragile wives, and arbiters of family reputation. When their wives sought treatment for hysteria, they believed it was simply a matter of weak health, delicate nerves, or an imbalance that required medical correction. Few considered the possibility that the treatments were providing something far beyond what marriage offered. The illusion of control, so central to male identity, remained intact because no one dared to speak of what truly occurred behind the doors of medical offices. For many husbands, the therapy was a relief rather than a cause for concern. Their wives returned calmer, less irritable, and more compliant after sessions. Household tensions eased, quarrels diminished, and the smooth surface of family life was restored. To the men, this was proof that medicine had succeeded where domestic authority alone was insufficient. It is almost laughable to imagine Victorian husbands congratulating doctors for curing their wives' nerves, never realizing that the cure was something they themselves had never been able to provide. They thought they were preserving order, when in reality the foundation of their control was being quietly undermined. The women, of course, knew the difference. They understood that the relief they experienced was not simply a matter of restored balance, but of sensations they were forbidden to name. For many, the treatments became a comparison point, showing them how limited their marriages truly were. Husbands might have thought themselves providers of security and stability, yet the one thing they never gave their wives was the acknowledgement of female pleasure. In the medical office, women found what was absent in the bedroom, though cloaked in the language of science. The contrast was sharp, and it reshaped how women perceived their own lives. This silent awakening was never meant to be revolutionary, but it carried consequences. Women who had once accepted their roles without question now carried secret knowledge that their bodies were capable of more than duty. They could not voice it, but they felt it, and feeling it was enough to erode the authority of husbands who believed themselves complete masters. The irony was that men themselves funded this awakening, paying medical bills and encouraging treatments without understanding what they enabled. It is not unlike how, in modern times, some people sometimes sponsor programs or technologies without realizing they are also funding movements that will eventually challenge their own authority. By supporting what they thought was harmless, Victorian men inadvertently opened the door to change. In diaries and letters, some women hinted at the divide between what their husbands assumed and what they actually experienced. They described returning from treatments with a sense of renewal that their marriages never brought. They spoke of carrying secrets that, if revealed, would threaten everything their family stood for. These confessions were rare, often hidden or destroyed, but they reveal the quiet shift in perception taking place across an entire generation. Women did not necessarily seek rebellion, but they could no longer believe entirely in the myths their society imposed. Husbands, meanwhile, clung to their ignorance. They trusted the medical establishment, believing that science would strengthen the order they prized. They rarely asked detailed questions, and when they did, the answers were cloaked in respectable jargon. Doctors had no reason to disrupt this arrangement, for the silence protected them as well. Everyone maintained the illusion, and in that illusion lay the seeds of transformation. I find it haunting to imagine men sitting in their studies, confident in their authority, while just across town their wives were encountering truths that those men could neither provide nor control. The world remained outwardly unchanged, yet beneath the surface it was shifting. The consequences of this hidden divide were subtle but lasting. Women began to internalize the knowledge that their well-being did not depend entirely on their husbands. They learned that there were other sources of relief, other authorities besides the men in their homes. This awareness, though buried under layers of propriety, weakened the myth of male indispensability. Husbands thought they were reinforcing their households by encouraging treatment, but in fact, they were revealing that their authority was less absolute than it seemed. This weakening of male power was not dramatic. It did not appear in open challenges or confrontations. Instead, it eroded authority quietly, like water wearing away stone. Each treatment reminded women of their own capacity, of their own physical truth, and of the limitations of their marriages. Over time, the unspoken comparison grew sharper, even if it was never admitted aloud. Husbands remained in the dark, convinced of their supremacy, while their wives carried within them the memory of a reality that undermined it. The hypocrisy of Victorian values allowed this contradiction to flourish. Society claimed that men were protectors of virtue, yet it tolerated a system in which women found what men could not give. Doctors benefited, families pretended, and men congratulated themselves on their roles, even as their authority was being chipped away in silence. The result was a paradox that defined the age power was proclaimed as absolute, yet it was quietly dissolving behind closed doors. Victorian men thought they were protecting their families by sending their wives to doctors, but they were, without realizing it, enabling a private revolution of the body. Their wives returned home outwardly unchanged, but inside they carried proof that male power was not total. This proof did not need to be spoken, it was enough that it was felt, and once it was felt, it could not be erased. Husbands paid the bills, encouraged the visits, and remained oblivious, all while their wives discovered something transformative. The men believed themselves irreplaceable, yet they had been replaced in the one realm they never considered vulnerable. Authority endured on the surface, but beneath it, the ground was shifting. That shift, hidden but irreversible, would lay the groundwork for new ways of resistance that husbands could neither predict nor prevent. In the rigid structure of Victorian marriage, women had very few tools with which to resist neglect or humiliation. Divorce was nearly impossible, separation brought scandal, and open confrontation risked ruin. Yet within this suffocating environment, some women found a subtle means of asserting themselves, the therapy prescribed for hysteria. What had been presented as a cure for frail nerves became, in their hands, a quiet form of retaliation. When husbands were dismissive, indifferent, or openly cruel, their wives turned not to arguments but to appointments. The treatment, cloaked in medical respectability, allowed them to take back a measure of control. These women discovered that they could feign illness to secure more frequent visits to the doctor. By exaggerating symptoms, they created opportunities for relief that were also acts of defiance. To the outside world, they were dutiful wives attending to their health. To themselves, they were exacting revenge for slights that would otherwise go unanswered. It is almost bitterly amusing to imagine husbands scoffing at their wives' supposed weakness. While those wives secretly sought pleasures the men themselves denied them. The irony was complete. What men dismissed as frailty became a weapon their wives used against them. For some, the act of seeking treatment was a way of balancing the scales in marriages where intimacy had withered. A husband might ignore his wife in the bedroom, but she could still claim release elsewhere in the name of medicine. She could return to her household calmer, not because of him, but in spite of him. This quiet inversion of power was not spoken of, but it was deeply felt. The secrecy made it all the more potent, for silence was the shield that allowed the practice to thrive. The most striking cases were those in which women began scheduling daily sessions. Their husbands might have assumed they were unusually unwell, fragile in constitution, or plagued by chronic symptoms. They had no idea that their wives were using medical appointments as both sanctuary and protest. The constant rhythm of treatment became a statement in itself if the marriage failed to provide recognition. The doctor's office would. It is not unlike modern relationships where partners turn to outside distractions or indulgences when emotional needs go unmet, quietly crafting a life beyond the reach of the relationship. The strategy may be hidden, but the message is unmistakable. For the women themselves, these choices carried both relief and risk. They experienced empowerment in crafting their own path, but they also shouldered the burden of secrecy. If discovered, their actions could have brought shame or worse. Yet many persisted, weighing the danger against the satisfaction of knowing they were no longer entirely powerless. The therapy became more than treatment. It became a silent form of resistance against the limitations of their lives. This defiance reshaped the meaning of hysteria within marriage. Husbands had once mocked or pitied their wives for supposed weakness, but those wives now transformed weakness into strength. They turned the diagnosis into an excuse, a shield that permitted them to pursue relief without accusation. The very word that had once diminished them became their cover for rebellion. The hidden balance of power shifted, not with noise or spectacle, but in the quiet regularity of appointments marked in diaries and calendars. Doctors, whether knowingly or not, facilitated this resistance. They continued to prescribe sessions, often without questioning the motives behind repeated visits. For some physicians, the growing demand was simply good business. For others, it was confirmation of their theories about hysteria. Rarely did they consider that the women before them were also making choices, crafting strategies, and using the treatments for purposes far beyond what medicine claimed. I cannot help but see this as a reminder that even in the most repressive structures, women found ways to carve out autonomy, sometimes in places no one expected. The existence of this hidden resistance highlights the contradictions of Victorian society. Outwardly, women were portrayed as passive, obedient, and dependent. Yet beneath the surface, they were resourceful, using the tools available to them to shape their own lives. Their rebellion was not public, but it was no less real. The irony was that the very system designed to control them provided the mechanism through which they resisted. Hysteria treatment, meant to pacify, became a form of protest in disguise. For some husbands, the results were baffling. Their wives seemed healthier, calmer, and strangely untouchable. The men never understood why their authority no longer held the same weight, why their dismissiveness was met not with despair but with quiet resilience. The truth was hidden in the consulting rooms, where women found affirmation of their existence that marriage denied. The broader lesson of this hidden defiance is clear power never rests entirely where it seems. Victorian men thought they commanded every aspect of their wives' lives, but those wives had found a space beyond their reach. In the paradoxical world of hysteria treatment, what looked like submission became rebellion, and what looked like weakness became strength. Victorian women used their therapy not only as medicine, but as a way to strike back at indifference. They cloaked their rebellion in respectability, but its effects rippled through their marriages. In the silence of the doctor's office, they reclaimed something husbands had withheld, and in doing so, they exposed the cracks in the authority that defined the age. The rebellion was private, but its implications were far-reaching, showing that even the quietest acts of defiance could unsettle the strongest illusions of control. Among the many whispered stories that circulated through Victorian society, few were as unsettling as the case of a wealthy woman who suffered a miscarriage late in her pregnancy. The tragedy was attributed not to illness or accident, but to her dependence on the very treatment prescribed for hysteria. She had grown accustomed to the new vibrating machines, devices celebrated in medical circles as innovations that spared physicians the fatigue of manual therapy. Yet in her final months, the repeated use of such a device proved catastrophic. What was meant to restore balance ended in the loss of a child, a calamity that her family sought desperately to hide. The official records never named the cause. Hospital notes listed general complications, vague phrases that concealed the truth. But servants whispered, attendants shared fragments of what they saw, and soon the story travelled in hushed tones across drawing rooms. The respectable world could not allow open discussion, but silence only sharpened curiosity. Women began to wonder whether the same treatments they cherished might also endanger them. It is almost grotesquely ironic that a culture so terrified of female pleasure ignored the risks of overuse until tragedy forced the subject into the shadows. The contradiction was glaring. Society tolerated the therapy as long as it was unspoken, yet refused to acknowledge its dangers even when they became undeniable. The woman at the centre of the story was not unusual in her devotion to treatment. Like many of her peers, she had turned to therapy as both relief and ritual, scheduling appointments with a regularity that resembled religious practice. The machine, marketed as a marvel of science, allowed her to replicate the sessions more frequently and in greater privacy. For her, it was a liberation from dependence on doctors, a chance to control her own routine, but control proved illusory. The very intensity she sought became the force that betrayed her body. This tragedy revealed the hidden risks of a practice never fully understood. Doctors rarely studied the long-term effects of repeated therapy, and patients were discouraged from asking questions. The cultural silence that cloaked hysteria treatment extended to its dangers as well. Women were told only of relief, never of risk. When complications arose, they were dismissed as coincidences or quietly erased from official accounts. The illusion of safety was preserved at the expense of truth. It is not unlike how, in modern times, certain health fads are embraced without scrutiny, celebrated for their benefits while their hidden dangers are ignored until disaster forces recognition. The pattern of willful ignorance has deep roots. For the women who heard the rumours, the story was both terrifying and oddly alluring. On one hand, it confirmed their deepest fears that the relief they depended upon might carry hidden costs. On the other, it intensified their fascination with the strong sensation the machines provided. Danger often sharpens desire, and in a society where every form of female indulgence was forbidden, the forbidden became irresistible. Some women asked themselves quietly whether the risk was worth the reward, a question they would never have dared to voice aloud. The family of the woman who suffered the miscarriage did everything possible to suppress the truth. Servants were silenced, papers destroyed, and explanations crafted to protect their reputation. Respectability demanded denial, even in the face of undeniable loss. To admit the role of treatment would have meant acknowledging practices that polite society refused to name. The illusion of morality was preserved, but at the cost of honesty and, most tragically, at the cost of life. I find it chilling to think of how grief itself was forced into silence, reshaped to fit the boundaries of a culture that feared exposure more than it valued truth. Doctors, too, had a stake in keeping the matter quiet. The new machines had been hailed as triumphs of medical innovation, tools that increased efficiency and reduced strain. A scandal linking them to miscarriage would have jeopardized their acceptance and threatened the reputations of those who promoted them. Thus, the medical establishment turned its gaze away, treating the tragedy as an unfortunate anomaly rather than evidence of a deeper problem. Yet the whispers did not fade entirely. Women who frequented clinics heard fragments of the story, and their reactions varied. Some grew fearful, hesitating to seek treatment as often as before. Others became more determined, convinced that the intensity of sensation was worth any danger. The secrecy only fueled speculation, and speculation, in turn, fueled demand. The paradox of Victorian morality reasserted itself. What was hidden became powerful. What was forbidden became irresistible. The story of the miscarriage thus became more than a single tragedy. It was a symbol of the risks created by silence, of the dangers concealed beneath the surface of propriety. It demonstrated that a culture built on denial could not protect its women, even when the cost was death. It revealed how the obsession with appearances eclipsed compassion, how families and doctors alike preferred falsehood to truth. In the end, the woman's loss remained buried in euphemism, her suffering erased from official memory. But in the private imaginations of other women, it lived on as both warning and temptation. They continued to seek their treatments, continued to rely on the machines, and continued to balance relief against risk. The tragedy had not destroyed the practice. If anything, it had intensified the aura of danger that surrounded it, giving it a darker allure. Victorian women heard the rumour, weighed it in silence, and made their choices alone. Their families suppressed the truth, their doctors ignored it, and society pretended nothing had happened. Yet the memory lingered, a reminder that even in the realm of hidden therapies, there were limits that could not be ignored. The contradiction remained: relief was possible, but so was destruction, and the line between them was as thin as the silence that sustained it. Victorian doctors, always eager to present themselves as custodians of order and stability, found another use for the therapy they prescribed so liberally for hysteria. They began to recommend pelvic treatments not only for vague nervous complaints, but also for managing the cycles of menstruation. Women who once endured those days in silence, confined to their rooms and burdened with both physical discomfort and social stigma, were now quietly told that sessions before, during, and after their periods could bring relief. The language was clinical, careful never to suggest pleasure, but the practice carried consequences far beyond what doctors admitted. Menstruation in the Victorian era was surrounded by silence and taboo. Women were instructed to conceal any mention of it, to behave as though it did not exist, even while it shaped the rhythm of their lives. In polite society, the subject was almost unmentionable, relegated to whispers among mothers and daughters. Pain and irritability were endured privately, often with little more than herbal teas or vague tonics for support. Against this backdrop, the suggestion that treatment might ease the burden was quietly revolutionary. It offered not only physical relief, but also the possibility of dignity in a society that denied women both. The women who received such treatments often reported notable improvements. They slept better, their tempers eased, and their households benefited from the stability. It is almost absurd to imagine Victorian physicians congratulating themselves for calming women's moods while carefully ignoring that what they had prescribed was a disguised route to orgasm. Yet the results spoke for themselves. In private notes and observations, doctors recorded the reduced irritability of their patients as evidence that the therapy was working. They framed it as medical proof of balance restored, even as the true cause of that balance remained unspoken. For women, the relief was profound. They had been taught to endure their monthly cycles as a mark of weakness, something to be borne silently without complaint. To be offered a form of care, however veiled, was a radical departure from that expectation. In the treatment room, they were given attention, recognition, and respite from discomfort. They might not have been allowed to name the sensation for what it was, but they felt the difference it made in their lives. Their energy returned, their sleep deepened, and their tempers softened, giving them the strength to resume the roles demanded of them. This development also reinforced the perception that the therapy was more than quackery. When women reported consistent improvements during menstruation, It lent weight to the argument that the sessions had genuine medical value. Doctors pointed to these results as proof that hysteria was not merely imagined, but a condition that could be managed scientifically. The irony was that by using the therapy to manage menstrual symptoms, they came close to acknowledging that orgasm itself had therapeutic effects, yet they never dared to frame it in such words. It is not unlike how modern medicine sometimes rediscovers the benefits of practices long dismissed, rebranding them in clinical terms while sidestepping the cultural taboos that once condemned them. The secrecy remained essential. Husbands were rarely informed of the specifics of these prescriptions, only told that their wives were being treated for frailty or exhaustion. The word menstruation itself was often avoided, replaced by euphemisms that softened the reality. This allowed the illusion of propriety to continue, even as women quietly experienced a new form of autonomy within the consulting room. Their cycles, once burdens carried in silence, became moments when they could justify care and attention without reproach. The effect on women's inner lives was significant. For the first time, some felt that their discomfort was acknowledged, that their needs were seen as legitimate, even if the recognition came wrapped in layers of medical jargon and cultural denial. It mattered. They learned to associate their cycles not only with pain but with the promise of relief, a shift that subtly reshaped how they experienced their own bodies. I find it striking to imagine how many women, long trained to despise or hide their monthly cycles, found in these treatments a rare form of acceptance, however incomplete. The broader implications were not lost on those who paid attention. If pelvic treatment could ease menstrual discomfort, then clearly it had effects beyond hysteria. But to admit this would have required breaking the silence around female sexuality, a step Victorian society refused to take. Instead, the evidence was buried under careful phrasing, reduced to vague references to calming the nerves or restoring equilibrium. The truth lay hidden in plain sight, acknowledged only through results but never through words. For women, however, the truth needed no words. Their bodies told them what the medical language refused to admit. They left their sessions calmer, steadier, and more resilient, carrying with them the knowledge that relief was possible. Even if they could never name it, they felt it, and the feeling was enough to transform their experience of one of life's most silenced realities. In this way, Victorian medicine, despite its repression and denial, inadvertently gave women a form of power. By prescribing treatments during menstruation, it allowed them to experience moments of comfort and autonomy otherwise denied by culture. It confirmed that their bodies mattered, even if the acknowledgement was indirect. It also reinforced their growing attachment to therapy, ensuring that the cycle of dependence deepened with every month that passed. Victorian women, once taught to endure their cycles in shame and silence, found in pelvic therapy a private form of recognition. Their doctors avoided the truth, their families remained ignorant, but within the consulting room, they discovered relief that society had never allowed them to expect. This relief, however disguised, gave them not only calm but also the quiet assurance that their bodies could not be entirely erased by silence. As the 19th century wore on, hysteria treatment spread far beyond the exclusive circles of wealthy women and entered the lives of the rising middle class. What had once been the privilege of ladies with private physicians soon became accessible to housewives who lived in respectable but less extravagant circumstances. Private clinics began to appear in discreet corners of towns and cities, offering services specifically tailored to these women. The locations were often modest and the advertisements vague, yet the demand was undeniable. Respectable matrons who might never have set foot in a brothel or confided in a physician about intimate matters now found themselves quietly arranging appointments for a therapy spoken of only in whispers. The process of entry into these clinics was carefully guarded. They did not accept unknown patients without a recommendation. Instead, introductions were made through friends, relatives, or trusted acquaintances, ensuring that those who came could be relied upon to keep the silence. This network of referrals created a hidden community of women bound together by secrecy and need. The intimacy of the experience demanded discretion, and so the system ensured that only those deemed trustworthy would be admitted. It is almost funny to think of Victorian housewives forming what amounted to secret clubs, passing along names of doctors as though they were sharing recipes for jam or instructions for embroidery. The veneer of respectability remained intact, but beneath it lay a very different kind of exchange. The popularity of these clinics quickly outstripped their capacity. Appointments were booked far in advance, with waiting lists that grew longer each month. Women juggled household duties, family schedules, and social obligations around their therapy sessions. The demand was so great that some clinics resembled modern beauty salons in their scheduling, with carefully managed calendars and overburdened staff. It is not unlike the way people now compete for appointments at fashionable spas or cosmetic clinics, eager to secure their place in a system that promises transformation, even if only for a short time. In this sense, the past feels surprisingly familiar. For the women themselves, the rush to secure appointments reflected not vanity but survival. These treatments had become lifelines, offering relief from the relentless demands of domestic life. They provided not only physical release but also a psychological anchor, a reminder that their bodies had needs beyond cooking, cleaning, and child rearing. To miss an appointment was to risk slipping back into irritability, exhaustion, and despair. Thus, they pursued their sessions with an urgency that revealed just how deeply the therapy had taken root in their lives. The clinics that served these women cultivated an atmosphere of calm professionalism. Waiting rooms were quiet, with heavy curtains, muted colours, and a sense of solemnity. Patients avoided conversation, knowing that discretion was part of the unspoken agreement. A glance might pass between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience, but words were rarely exchanged. Each woman carried her own reasons for being there, and each trusted the silence to protect her from exposure. The existence of these clinics also widened the social reach of hysteria treatment. It was no longer confined to aristocrats or the wealthiest households. Middle-class women, whose lives were defined by a constant balance between respectability and repression, now joined the hidden ritual. This democratization of therapy did not make it any less secretive, but it did make it more pervasive. Entire neighborhoods became quietly familiar with the addresses of clinics, even if no one dared to admit it aloud. For doctors, the demand proved lucrative. They could fill their days with patients, scheduling sessions in rapid succession, and charge fees that added up quickly. The clinics thrived on repetition, each woman requiring treatment not once but over and over again. The cycle of dependency guaranteed steady business, and the culture of silence ensured that few would ever question it. Physicians became gatekeepers of both relief and respectability, their roles sustained by the collusion of society's unspoken rules. The popularity of these clinics also exposed the tension between morality and necessity. Families prided themselves on propriety, yet they tolerated wives and daughters disappearing for hours under the guise of medical appointments. Husbands paid the bills without asking too many questions, relieved that their households ran more smoothly. The contradiction was obvious, but it was smothered beneath silence. Everyone benefited, so no one dared to disrupt the illusion. I cannot help but think that the eagerness of these women to secure appointments shows just how starved they were for recognition, for even the smallest acknowledgement of their own humanity. In that sense, the waiting lists were not just about treatment, they were about survival. The image of housewives scrambling for appointments at hidden clinics illustrates how far the practice had spread and how deeply it had become embedded in Victorian life. What began as a supposed medical cure had grown into a social necessity, sustained by secrecy and demand. The more appointments were booked, the more entrenched the system became. By the end of the century, hysterical treatment was less an oddity and more a quiet institution. Woven into the daily routines of countless women, Victorian clinics filled their schedules with middle-class patients, turning therapy into a commodity as well as a cure. Women competed for access. Families paid the fees, and silence preserved the entire arrangement. The rush for appointments revealed both the hunger for relief and the hollowness of a culture that denied women recognition in every other part of their lives. The contradiction deepened, and the weight of silence grew heavier, even as the demand only increased. Among the most revealing traces of Victorian hysteria treatment are the diaries that a small number of women began to keep. These were not public confessions, nor even documents meant to be shared with family. They were secret records, written in careful handwriting, often hidden in locked drawers or tucked inside sewing baskets. In them, women described the sensations they experienced during therapy, the shifts in their moods, and even the strange, undefined affection they sometimes felt toward the physicians who treated them. The act of writing was both daring and dangerous. To put into words what could not be spoken aloud was to challenge the silence that governed their lives. The content of these journals varied, but certain patterns emerged. Women wrote of relief from their nerves, of the sudden quieting of restless thoughts, of the calm that settled in their bodies after treatment. They described their gratitude, sometimes in terms that bordered on devotion, sometimes in language that hinted at something closer to infatuation. It is almost comical to imagine physicians insisting that their work was purely clinical, while their patients were at home writing diary entries that read like secret declarations of intimacy. The gap between the official narrative and the private reality was wide, and the diaries make that gap impossible to ignore. For the women who kept them, the diaries served several purposes. They were a way of making sense of experiences that had no legitimate language. Medical texts offered only vague references to pelvic relaxation or release of nervous energy. But these women felt something far more concrete. By writing, they gave form to sensations society refused to name. They also used the diaries as emotional outlets, places where they could admit feelings of guilt, longing, or even joy that had no other place to exist. The private act of recording gave them a voice, however muted, in a world that demanded silence. Not all diaries were purely descriptive. Some took on the character of love letters, addressed not to the physicians directly, but written as though the women were speaking to them. Phrases of gratitude blurred into words of affection, and affection sometimes edged into desire. To read them now is to see the profound confusion Victorian women faced, caught between medical reassurance and undeniable bodily experience. They were told it was treatment, yet their hearts recorded it as something more. It is not unlike how modern people sometimes confuse therapy with intimacy, mistaking professional attention for personal affection. The boundaries were fragile, and the emotions spilled over. The secrecy surrounding these diaries was intense. Women understood the danger of exposure. If discovered, such writings could ruin reputations, destroy marriages, and bring scandal upon entire families. For that reason, many were destroyed deliberately, burned in fireplaces or torn to pieces before death. The few that survived did so by accident, forgotten in locked boxes, preserved among old letters, or hidden in archives where no one thought to look. When they finally emerged, they caused a stir among those who read them, particularly in medical circles. Doctors who encountered these documents often reacted with discomfort. Some dismissed them as the confused ramblings of unstable women, unwilling to admit what they revealed about the therapy itself. Others, more honest, recognized them as invaluable records of the psychological impact of treatment. These diaries made it impossible to maintain the fiction that the therapy was purely medical. They showed clearly that women experienced it as something deeply personal, something that touched not just the body but the emotions. I find it remarkable that even through the heavy silence of their world, some women risked preserving the truth in writing, leaving behind testimonies that speak more loudly than anything their doctors admitted. The existence of these diaries also reshaped how later generations understood hysteria treatment. Historians and researchers found in them evidence of the contradictions that defined Victorian life. They revealed how women navigated the gulf between societal expectation and private experience, how they used the tools available to them, pen, paper, and secrecy, to carve out spaces of honesty. The very act of writing was resistance, a refusal to let their experiences vanish into silence. For the women who wrote them, however, the diaries were not meant as rebellion but as survival. They were coping mechanisms, helping to reconcile the impossible contradiction of feeling pleasure in a society that condemned it. Writing allowed them to process guilt, to confess without confessing, to acknowledge what could not be spoken aloud. In doing so, they created records that would outlive them, becoming some of the few direct voices we have from within this hidden world. The tension captured in these journals is palpable. Lines shift between relief and shame, between gratitude and resentment, between medical justification and emotional truth. They show how women lived within the contradictions imposed upon them, and how they tried to make sense of those contradictions in private. The diaries are not polished or systematic, but they are deeply human. They carry the marks of women who longed for recognition, even if it came only from their own pens. In the broader context of Victorian society, these writings were acts of quiet defiance. They preserved truths that everyone else worked to erase, challenging the silence that cloaked hysteria treatment. Though hidden at the time, they have become invaluable now, offering insights into experiences otherwise lost. They show that even in the most repressive eras, voices found ways to survive, waiting to be heard. Victorian women, through their secret diaries, left behind fragile but powerful evidence of how therapy shaped their lives. They wrote of relief, of longing, of guilt, and of gratitude, weaving together the contradictions that define their age. Their words, once hidden in drawers and boxes, now serve as testimony against the silence that once smothered them. In their quiet pages lies a truth that outlived both the doctors who treated them and the society that sought to deny them. Among the strangest stories to emerge from the hidden world of Victorian hysteria treatment was the tale of an elderly woman who, upon her death, left behind a shocking request in her will. She asked that her favourite therapeutic device, a vibrating machine prescribed years earlier for her nerves, be buried with her. The instruction was written plainly, without apology, as though she considered it as essential to her existence in death as it had been in life. Her family, embarrassed and bewildered, tried to keep the matter quiet, but secrecy is fragile. Servants preparing the funeral arrangements discovered the device among her belongings and whispered the story until it slipped beyond the household walls. The idea of a respectable lady being buried with such an object was almost unthinkable. Victorian society prided itself on propriety even in death, with funerals staged as solemn affirmations of dignity. For a woman to demand that her therapeutic device accompany her into the grave was to break that illusion entirely. It is almost absurd to imagine sermons on purity being read at her funeral, while somewhere beneath the coffin lid lay a contraption designed to deliver orgasms. The contrast between public performance and private truth could not have been sharper. The revelation caused outrage in some circles. Families whispered that it was indecent, clergy condemned it as scandalous, and even some physicians sought to distance themselves from the story. Yet for many women who heard of it, the reaction was more complicated. Instead of condemnation, there was a quiet sense of understanding. They knew why she had made the request, even if they would never admit it aloud. They too had felt the dependence, the comfort, the relief that the therapy provided. For them, the story was not merely about eccentricity, but about recognition. This strange testament exposed the depth of attachment that many women had developed to their treatments. It was not simply medicine, nor was it mere indulgence. It had become, for some, the single most reliable source of relief in lives burdened by silence and repression. To ask to be buried with such a device was, in its way, an acknowledgement of truth, a declaration that her life, shaped by denial and propriety, had found its only honesty in that machine. It is not unlike the way some people today request to be buried with cherished objects like a favourite book or photograph, though in this case, the object was one society refused to acknowledge even in life. For the servants who uncovered the request, the experience was unsettling. They had likely assisted her with treatments, cleaning equipment, or preparing rooms, and now they were confronted with the undeniable evidence of her devotion. Their whispers carried both shock and recognition, for they knew that her story was not unique. Other women in other houses relied on the same devices, bound to them by the same unspoken dependence. The difference was only that this woman had dared to put her truth into writing. Doctors, too, were implicated by the tale. They had long presented the devices as medical innovations, tools to restore balance and calm. To see one requested in a will revealed that patients viewed them in a far more personal light. It was evidence that the therapy had crossed into the realm of identity, becoming part of who women believed themselves to be. Physicians could not acknowledge this without shattering the illusion of clinical detachment, and so they, too, buried the story beneath layers of silence. The broader public treated the affair as a scandal, but for women, it resonated differently. Many could not help but feel sympathy, even admiration, for the honesty of the request. She had dared to admit, at least privately, what so many of them felt but could never say, that the therapy had given her life something marriage, motherhood, and society never had. Her demand for burial with the device was outrageous to some, but to others, it was a kind of liberation. I cannot help but see it as a tragic reminder of how far Victorian society forced women to hide, that even their last wishes could become scandals simply for acknowledging their own bodies. The story endured precisely because it struck at the heart of Victorian contradictions. A society that preached dignity and morality could not reconcile itself with the reality that its women clung so fiercely to the very practices it refused to name. The scandal was not simply that a woman wanted her device in the grave, but that she had exposed, even inadvertently, the widespread dependence shared by countless others. In time, the tale became more than gossip. It became a kind of symbol for the unspoken truths of the era, whispered by women who secretly saw themselves in the wealthy widow's choice. They might never have dared to write such a request of their own will, but they felt the depth of her attachment as their own. In her act of final honesty, they found both recognition and solidarity. The wealthy woman's device was placed in the coffin, hidden from public eyes but preserved in rumour. Her family tried to erase the shame, but in doing so, they only ensured that the whispers would last longer. The burial became a metaphor for an entire generation, women laid to rest beneath the weight of silence, their truths hidden, their attachments unacknowledged, but never entirely erased. Victorian women who heard of this burial could not forget it. The scandal shocked some, comforted others, and unsettled nearly everyone. It revealed the depths of a dependence too widespread to deny, yet too forbidden to speak. And it left behind the haunting question of how many other women, though never discovered, carried the same wish into their graves. In the late Victorian years, as medicine slowly opened its doors to women, a small number of female physicians began to appear in practices that had long been dominated by men. Their presence was a quiet revolution in itself, challenging assumptions that women lacked the rationality or discipline to practice medicine. For women diagnosed with hysteria, this shift carried an unexpected consequence. Being treated by a female doctor removed a layer of shame that so often accompanied sessions with men. Instead of fearing the silent judgment of a male physician, patients could relax into the illusion that they were simply being cared for by someone who understood their lives more closely. The atmosphere in these consulting rooms was different. Patients described feeling less exposed, less humiliated, and more at ease under the hands of women. While the treatment itself did not change in its core, the approach often did. Female physicians were less brusque, less mechanical, and sometimes more willing to experiment with techniques that felt gentler. It is almost ironic that in a society so determined to deny women autonomy, it was female doctors who made the medical experience less harsh, even while delivering the same so-called cure. Their presence transformed what had once felt clinical and alien into something that seemed almost compassionate. Some patients began to prefer female doctors exclusively, even travelling farther or paying more to be seen by them. The comfort of knowing they would not be exposed to the detached gaze of a man mattered more than convenience. For these women, the experience of treatment was no longer only about relief, but also about the emotional safety of the environment. They found themselves able to admit details of their struggles that they would never have dared to voice to a male physician. In this way, the entry of women into medicine quietly shifted the balance of power, offering female patients a measure of trust that had long been absent. The female doctors themselves often saw their role as both scientific and protective. They understood the taboos surrounding the body, and they knew how damaging silence could be. Within the walls of their practices, they attempted to provide a different kind of care, one that acknowledged both the physical and the emotional dimensions of their patients' suffering. Some even developed techniques they described as more delicate, more considerate of their patients' comfort. It is not unlike the modern contrast between a rushed, impersonal consultation and one where the physician takes time to listen, where patients leave feeling seen as human beings rather than cases. These subtle shifts carried enormous weight in the private lives of their patients. This change also altered the nature of relationships within the consulting room. Women began to form connections with their female doctors that blurred the boundaries between medical authority and personal trust. There was still silence, still denial, but there was also a sense of solidarity. The patients felt that their experiences were understood in ways no man could replicate. Some even developed strong attachments, not romantic in the conventional sense, but emotional bonds shaped by the intimacy of the treatment itself. The presence of female doctors also raised questions about propriety. Critics wondered if women could be trusted with such delicate matters, or if their involvement would encourage impropriety of another kind. But these concerns were largely ignored as the results spoke for themselves. Patients improved, their households ran more smoothly, and society was content to overlook the details as long as appearances remained intact. What mattered was that the illusion of respectability was preserved, even as the reality of practice shifted beneath the surface. For the women being treated, the change was profound. They no longer felt as though they were submitting to a procedure imposed from above. Instead, they could frame the experience as one woman helping another, a form of care that belonged less to authority and more to mutual recognition. This subtle shift gave them a measure of dignity in a system designed to deny it. The intimacy of the treatment was still shrouded in silence, but it no longer carried the same weight of humiliation. The rise of female doctors also exposed the hollowness of the idea that hysteria was purely medical. If the therapy could be administered by men or women, if it could vary in style and tone, then its meaning was not fixed but deeply tied to context. Patients experienced it differently depending on who provided it, which revealed that the treatment was never just about nerves or balance. It was about the human connection, the recognition of bodies and needs that society refused to acknowledge. I find it striking that in an era when women were excluded from most forms of authority, they found in medicine a way to alter the lives of their peers. Their presence reshaped the most intimate of treatments, turning what had been a source of shame into something that could feel almost protective. Even within the constraints of Victorian morality, they carved out spaces where care felt less like domination and more like understanding. The involvement of female doctors changed the texture of hysteria treatment, softening its harshness and deepening the bonds it created. Patients trusted them more, confided in them more, and left their offices with a sense that they had been cared for by someone who saw them as a whole. It was a small shift, but it carried great weight. In the silence of their consulting rooms, a new kind of relationship emerged, one that suggested that women might hold within themselves the answer society had long denied them. Victorian women who sought out female physicians found relief not only from their symptoms, but from the weight of shame itself. In those private rooms, the balance of power tilted ever so slightly, hinting at the possibility that even within silence, there were ways to reclaim dignity. And as these practices grew, they revealed that the future of medicine would not remain entirely in male hands. As the 19th century moved toward its close, the world of hysteria treatment began to change shape once more. What had once required the skill of a physician and the privacy of a clinic was gradually transformed into something that could be managed within the home. Manufacturers, sensing both profit and discretion, began to design devices specifically for women who wanted regular therapy without the trouble of appointments. These machines were smaller than the heavy contraptions used in hospitals, quieter than the cumbersome models powered by water or steam, and crafted in ways that suggested elegance rather than scandal. They were made to fit not into laboratories but into parlours and bedrooms, hidden among the other respectable objects of domestic life. The advertisements for these devices were as subtle as they were revealing. Instead of naming their purpose openly, they appeared in medical journals and women's magazines under vague titles such as nervous regulators, restorative appliances, or tonic instruments. The description spoke of calming the nerves, restoring balance, and assisting with female weakness. No one had to say more. Women who had already experienced the relief of clinical treatments understood perfectly what was being offered. The code was clear enough for those who needed it, while maintaining just enough ambiguity to keep respectability intact. It is almost laughable to imagine Victorian ladies flipping through respectable periodicals filled with recipes and sewing patterns, only to stumble upon discreet ads for devices designed to deliver orgasms. The appeal of these home machines lay not only in convenience but in privacy. A woman no longer had to make excuses for leaving the house, arranging transport, or justifying frequent medical visits. She could now manage her therapy in her own time, hidden behind the curtains of her bedroom. The discretion was liberating. It allowed women to indulge their dependence without fear of exposure. In some cases, it also gave them a sense of control over their own bodies that they had never known before. What had once been the domain of doctors now entered the domestic sphere, reshaping the balance of secrecy and autonomy. Manufacturers capitalized on this demand with ingenuity. They emphasized ease of use, marketing machines that were lighter, quieter, and easier to clean than their predecessors. Some even came packaged in boxes designed to resemble household items, ensuring that servants or guests would not suspect their true function. The careful engineering reflected the paradox of the age society demanded silence, yet industry worked tirelessly to supply the very devices that silence concealed. It is not unlike the modern wellness industry, where vague promises of balance and calm are used to market products whose true appeal lies in private indulgence. The profits were immense. Companies that specialized in medical equipment found that their sales of hysteria devices outpaced other products. Wealthy women purchased them discreetly, sometimes ordering through physicians, sometimes through coded catalogues. As word spread, the demand only grew. By the final decades of the century, some firms had built fortunes on these machines, yet no one outside the circle of users and doctors ever acknowledged their existence directly. It was an open secret, hidden in plain sight. For the women who owned them, the devices became part of daily life. Some wrote in their diaries about keeping them in locked cabinets. Others described the sense of reassurance they felt simply knowing the machine was available whenever needed. The devices offered not only relief but a strange form of companionship, an object that provided what neither husbands nor doctors could fully control. The intimacy was unspoken, but it shaped the rhythms of countless lives. This shift to home use also deepened the culture of dependence. Without the structure of appointments, women could indulge more frequently, sometimes daily. The therapy that had once been framed as an occasional medical necessity became routine, even habitual. Yet because the devices remained cloaked in medical language, women could continue to assure themselves that they were merely treating their nerves. Respectability was preserved by the thin veil of science, even as the truth of their attachment grew stronger. The story of these machines reveals the contradictions of Victorian life with painful clarity. Outwardly, society condemned female desire, insisting on silence and purity. In reality, it fostered an entire industry dedicated to sustaining it, as long as no one dared to name it for what it was. Doctors endorsed the devices, companies grew rich from them, and women relied on them for survival, all while the culture insisted that such things did not exist. I cannot help but think of how strange it must have felt for women to live in a world where their greatest source of relief was an object they could never acknowledge in conversation, not even with those closest to them. By the time these home devices became common, hysterical treatment was no longer only a medical practice. It had become a private ritual woven into domestic life, hidden behind curtains and cabinets, but no less powerful for being concealed. The clinic still operated, the doctors still prescribed, but the industry of home devices expanded the reach of therapy to a scale no one could have predicted. The paradox of silence deepened, for the more widespread the practice became, the less it could ever be admitted. Victorian women purchased devices, kept them in their homes, and relied on them as quietly as they breathed. The companies that made them flourished, their fortunes built on what society would not name. The therapy was no longer confined to consulting rooms. It had entered the very heart of the household, disguised as medicine, sustained by secrecy, and made indispensable by need. In this silent expansion lay both the triumph of industry and the tragedy of repression, a reminder that what society denied most fiercely was often what it depended on most. Letters written in careful script began to appear in doctors' offices, folded neatly and sealed with wax. They came from women who had undergone the so-called treatments for hysteria, and their tone was unlike ordinary correspondence. These were not the short, polite notes of gratitude one might expect for a prescription or a house call. They were long, personal, and full of language that blurred the line between medical thanks and romantic attachment. Women wrote of feeling restored, of having been given not just physical relief but a kind of rebirth. Some described their doctors as saviours, their touch as gentle beyond words, their presence as indispensable. The language was intimate, sometimes disturbingly so, as if the physician were not a practitioner but a figure of deep emotional importance. This kind of writing was dangerous in its honesty, in a society where women were told to remain silent about their own bodies. To put such thoughts on paper was an act of risk. Yet the secrecy of the doctor's office created a strange intimacy, and for many women, the experience of being treated, of being touched under the protection of science, was the only space where their bodies were acknowledged. Gratitude spilled into adoration, and adoration into words that looked far more like the letters of a lover than those of a patient. The irony is almost comical that in a world where love letters outside marriage were a scandal, women could send such words under the cover of medical thanks. Some doctors kept these letters, reading them in private, while others burned them immediately to protect their reputations. A few found their way into archives, preserved in hospital papers or personal collections, fragments of a hidden world that later generations would stumble upon. The survival of even a handful reveals how widespread this practice must have been. For every letter that escaped the fire, dozens more surely turned to ash, destroyed by hands too fearful of exposure. But the very fact that women risked writing them shows the depth of the connection they felt. What they could not say aloud in their drawing rooms, they dared to confess in ink. In many of these letters, the language hovered between spiritual and sensual. Women described themselves as purified, calmed, or released from burdens. They praised the miraculous method and spoke of their physicians as if they were guides leading them to salvation. The words carried both religious overtones and personal longing, and in that mixture, one can sense how confusing the experience must have been. Was it medicine? Was it intimacy? Or was it something neither category could fully contain? The ambiguity allowed women to write what they felt while pretending, at least to themselves, that they were speaking only of health. It is not so different from modern situations where people couch deep emotions in professional or polite language, all the while expressing something much larger underneath. The letters also reveal the loneliness that defined women's lives. With husbands often distant or dismissive, and society demanding silence, the physician became one of the few men with whom a woman could express vulnerability. The act of writing allowed her to preserve that intimacy, to reach beyond the confines of the appointment and maintain a connection. For some, it was perhaps the only way to articulate their longing for recognition and care. The fact that they were writing to a doctor made it acceptable, or at least less scandalous, but the feelings they poured onto the page were undeniably personal. For historians, these fragments of correspondence are invaluable. They expose the private consequences of practices that, on the surface, were framed as medical. They reveal how treatments designed to silence women's complaints instead created channels of emotional expression, and they remind us that behind the clinical notes and medical jargon were human beings, desperate for relief, intimacy, and acknowledgement. Reading about these letters, I find it haunting to imagine how many women must have held a pen in trembling hands, unsure whether they were writing to a doctor, a confidant, or a forbidden beloved. The act of writing itself was a rebellion against silence. To put feelings into words was to claim a space for the female voice, however indirect. That some of these letters survived at all suggests that they mattered too much to every writer to be entirely erased, even in a culture determined to suppress them. They stand today as quiet testimonies of desire hidden under the veil of medical respectability, a reminder that women always found ways to speak, even when forbidden to do so. Secret gatherings began to form in the quiet corners of Victorian society, hidden from the gaze of husbands, priests, and even curious servants. These were not the public clubs or tea parties that defined the respectable social life of women. Instead, they were meetings arranged through whispered invitations, handwritten notes slipped discreetly into gloved hands, or coded phrases exchanged in drawing rooms. The women who attended shared something that could never be admitted openly, a reliance on the so-called therapies that brought them physical relief and, more dangerously, a fleeting sense of liberation. Out of this common experience, secret circles began to emerge, groups that turned private indulgence into communal ritual. At these gatherings, each woman arrived with her own story. Some came from aristocratic houses, shielded by wealth and reputation, while others belonged to the rising middle class, women whose husbands worked in law, business, or politics. What united them was not social rank, but the discovery of a forbidden pleasure disguised as medicine. They would meet in discreet locations, often the homes of widows or wealthy matrons who had enough privacy to keep prying eyes away. Thick curtains were drawn, servants were dismissed, and a trusted few remained to guard the door. Within those walls, women shed the silence that ruled their daily lives and spoke with startling openness about their secret treatments. Each meeting carried the air of a ceremony. A hostess might open with tea, soft music, or even a reading from a medical journal that justified their actions under the language of health. Afterward, the conversation would shift toward personal experiences. Women described their sessions, the sensations they felt, and the improvements they claimed in mood and vitality. They exchanged advice on which physicians were the most discreet, which devices functioned most reliably, and which techniques produced the quickest relief. The words treatment and therapy were always used, never terms that hinted at desire. To preserve respectability, the gatherings operated under the shared rule it was medicine, not indulgence. Over time, these meetings evolved into something closer to an underground society. The women gave one another nicknames, playful monikers borrowed from literature, mythology, or even simple initials. A woman might be called Diana, another Persephone, another known only as M. These names created a veil of anonymity, allowing them to speak more freely while preserving some measure of secrecy. To be part of such a group was to belong to a sisterhood forged in silence and bound by shared experience. What society forbade, they remade into a ritual of belonging. The devices themselves became symbols of identity. Some women carried small, elegant instruments hidden within fabric pouches, while others arrived with larger, noisier contraptions concealed under shawls or in travel cases. They displayed them as one might present fine jewellery, admiring the craftsmanship, discussing improvements, and even trading tips for maintenance. To an outsider, the sight of respectable matrons passing around such machines would have seemed scandalous beyond measure. Within the safety of the group, however, it was as ordinary as comparing recipes or embroidery patterns. It is almost absurd to imagine the same women who hosted charitable teas during the week quietly gathering on weekends to compare the performance of vibrating devices. The rules of these circles were clear, absolute secrecy, no judgment, and above all, no acknowledgement that what they were doing had anything to do with sex. This last rule was essential. By framing their rituals as medical practice, they could justify participation to themselves, protecting their identities as wives and mothers. To call it pleasure would have been too dangerous, for it would have meant admitting to desire, and desire was the one thing women were never supposed to claim. By calling it health, they could both indulge and remain respectable, at least in their own minds. What is striking is how these gatherings gave women something they rarely had: community around their bodies. In a society that prized female ignorance, the act of sharing knowledge, however coded, was radical. They spoke openly of cycles, of moods, of physical needs, in ways that medical books and husbands refused to acknowledge. Through these conversations, women learned more about themselves and one another than any official education ever offered. For some, it may have been the first time they realized they were not alone in their frustrations, their longings, or their hidden habits. It reminds me of how modern support groups, whether for health, addiction, or personal struggle, provide a safe space to share what cannot be admitted elsewhere. These groups did not exist without risk. A careless word, a letter discovered, or a servant who overheard could destroy reputations. Some women faced suspicion when they spent too much time away from home, or when unexplained packages arrived at their doors. Husbands might question, priests might scold, and neighbours might whisper. To mitigate these dangers, the groups developed elaborate precautions. Meetings were rotated among members' homes to avoid patterns. Notes were written in vague language, often disguised as invitations to sewing circles or charitable committees. Even within the gatherings, some women wore veils or hats, fearing that recognition might one day bring shame. Despite the risks, the attraction was too powerful to resist. In these hidden societies, women found not only relief but also solidarity. They were no longer isolated patients visiting doctors in secret, but members of a collective bound by shared truth. The gatherings gave them strength to endure the hypocrisy of daily life, the silence demanded at dinner tables, the judgment whispered behind fans at social events. Together, they created a counterworld where female bodies were acknowledged, not denied. Historians who later uncovered traces of these circles were astonished by their existence. In the fragments of diaries, in coded letters, in anecdotes preserved by descendants, the evidence of these clandestine groups paints a vivid picture of resistance wrapped in respectability. They reveal that women were not entirely passive in the face of oppression, but carved out small spaces of autonomy where they could. I find it both tragic and inspiring to imagine these women, trapped by their era yet ingenious enough to create secret communities to sustain themselves. In the end, the secret societies of treatment tell us as much about Victorian culture as they do about women themselves. They expose the failure of a system that denied women's needs while forcing them into absurd performances of purity. They also reveal the creativity with which women navigated that system, finding ways to protect their dignity and sanity, even when it meant rewriting the rules in secret. Their meetings, their codes, their whispered exchanges, all were acts of survival, hidden beneath the polished surface of respectability. Victorian women created these underground circles not for rebellion in the open sense, but for survival in the hidden one. They gathered each month, brought their devices, and gave themselves nicknames to protect their identities. They built a sisterhood that society would never acknowledge, one born of silence yet filled with voices that finally spoke. It was a reminder that even in the most repressive cultures, women found ways to carve out spaces for themselves, however small, however secret, and however dangerous. For many women in the Victorian age, daily life was defined by expectation and control. Every gesture, every word, even the tilt of the head in public was judged against the rigid standards of morality. They were told how to walk, how to dress, how to sit, and most importantly, how to remain silent about anything that might suggest personal desire. In their homes, duties as wives and mothers consumed them, while society's watchful eye demanded that they embody obedience and restraint. Yet within the confines of medical therapy, something happened that broke through all of those restrictions. For a brief interval, they experienced a release that no rule could suppress. In those moments of climax, they felt free of demands, free of judgment, and free of the suffocating silence that governed their existence. The experience was not spoken of in terms of desire, nor admitted as pleasure. It was cloaked in medical language, explained as a nervous discharge or a therapeutic response. But behind the terminology, women recognized the sensation as something far deeper. For the first time, they were not mothers, wives, or daughters under scrutiny, but simply human beings inhabiting their own bodies. The sensation was startling because it gave them a glimpse of a self unshaped by duty. In the stillness that followed, many felt a clarity they could not find elsewhere. It was not about rebellion or even love. It was about being, however briefly, untethered from roles that defined their every waking hour. Doctors may have believed they were applying a clinical treatment, but for women, the moment was transformative. No one scolded them, no one demanded anything, and no one judged them during that release. The body answered only to itself, not to society's endless chorus of rules. The quiet afterward was described in diaries as peaceful, even holy, not because it was religious, but because it was the one place where they felt their existence mattered. The tragic humour of it is hard to miss. A society that demanded women stay pure created the one place where they could feel alive, all under the guise of a cure. The contrast between their ordinary lives and these hidden intervals was sharp. At home, they were ordered, criticised, or ignored. In the drawing rooms, they were expected to smile and entertain, hiding their exhaustion. In the sick room, during treatment, they found themselves stripped of all that and brought into contact with something they did not have words to name. Some described the moment as calming their nerves, others as restoring their balance. But the truth was simpler. It was the only time they belonged wholly to themselves. That knowledge lingered long after they left the clinic, even if they never dared to articulate it aloud. This fragile glimpse of selfhood created a dangerous longing. Once experienced, it could not be forgotten. Women began to crave not only the physical release but the sense of personhood it carried. Without it, they returned to their daily lives feeling trapped once more, suffocated by the expectations that pressed on them from every direction. In some cases, this longing became a kind of quiet rebellion, driving them back to doctors, devices, or secret societies where they could seek the experience again. It is not unlike the modern world, where people chase small pockets of freedom through hobbies, travel, or therapy, because daily life often leaves them feeling invisible. For those who became dependent, the treatment was more than relief. It was identity, a fleeting affirmation that they existed beyond the roles imposed on them. This is why some women wrote of it in their private journals, with words that blurred the line between medical gratitude and spiritual revelation. They did not have the vocabulary of liberation, but they knew the difference between obedience and freedom, between silence and acknowledgement. In that brief moment, they chose themselves, and that choice reshaped their understanding of what it meant to be alive. It is chilling to think that the only time many Victorian women felt like whole human beings was in a doctor's office, during a treatment never publicly named for what it was. The society that silenced them inadvertently created the very conditions for their awakening. Yet the cost was profound, because it was framed as an illness. Their freedom was always tied to shame, their humanity always bound to secrecy. I cannot escape the thought that this mixture of liberation and concealment must have been both intoxicating and cruel, giving them a taste of life while denying them the right to claim it. The irony lies in the fact that what was intended as a cure for women's weakness became, for many, the only source of their strength. They clung to it, not because it healed their nerves, but because it gave them something no sermon, no husband, and no law could provide the experience of being themselves. The world above demanded purity, silence, and obedience. But beneath the surface, in those guarded rooms, women touched freedom. They were not saints or sinners, not angels of the home, but simply human beings who, for once, were allowed to exist without apology. When the treatments were interrupted, the silence of Victorian life pressed in with crushing weight. Women who had once found relief in the carefully framed rituals of hysteria therapy suddenly faced a world stripped of that fragile outlet. To lose access to what they had been told was medical care was not merely the absence of a prescription, it was the removal of the one space where they felt free. For many, the effect was immediate and devastating. Without the release of those sessions, frustration built up in their bodies and minds until it erupted in ways that could no longer be hidden. Doctors recorded cases of women who fell into states of agitation after their treatments were stopped. Symptoms that had once been framed as hysteria returned with even greater force, trembling hands, sudden outbursts of weeping, sleepless nights, and uncontrollable fits of anger. Some grew so restless that they destroyed objects around them, overturning chairs, ripping fabric, or shattering glass in desperate attempts to externalize what could no longer be released through therapy. Family members, unprepared for such displays, interpreted the behavior as madness rather than grief. In homes where silence was sacred, the sound of breaking dishes or muffled sobs was a terrifying reminder that the system of control was fragile. The withdrawal was not only physical but emotional. These women had come to rely on therapy as the sole space where their existence was acknowledged, where their bodies were treated as more than vessels of duty. Without it, they were thrust back into the roles of obedient wives and silent mothers, with no reprieve. The sudden emptiness weighed heavily, and despair became a common companion. It is almost darkly ironic to think that what doctors had labelled an illness, and then treated with methods that brought undeniable relief, became an even deeper illness when that treatment was taken away. Families often responded poorly. Husbands, unaware of what the therapy truly entailed, dismissed their wives' distress as an overreaction or weakness. They instructed them to rest more, to pray, or to devote themselves to domestic duties as a distraction. Some women were sent away to relatives, others confined to their rooms, and still others admitted to asylums when their despair became unmanageable. In these institutions, the same women who had once been called patients in need of nervous relief were now labelled lunatics, abandoned to harsher forms of restraint. The irony was cruel. The very therapy that had kept them functional became the absence that condemned them. The emotional collapse was made worse by shame. Because women could never speak openly about what the therapy meant to them, they suffered in silence when it was taken away. To admit how much they depended on it would have been to admit desire, a confession society would not forgive. Instead, they cloaked their grief in vague words, telling relatives that they felt weak or unwell, hiding the true reason for their despair. Diaries from the era reveal women writing cryptic lines about emptiness, longing, and an unnamed loss. words that historians can now recognize as grief for the therapy itself. Their writing is filled with ellipses, pauses, and unfinished thoughts, as if even on paper they could not bring themselves to say the forbidden truth. Some women grew desperate enough to beg for alternative treatments. They sought new physicians, hoping to find someone who would continue what another had stopped. Others turned to the early devices that were entering households, grasping at technology as a way to replace the intimacy of the doctor's hand. But these substitutes were not always available or affordable, and the gap between need and access widened the suffering. It is not unlike the way modern dependence on medication or therapy can leave people vulnerable when access is cut off, exposing how fragile survival becomes when relief is tied to something beyond personal control. The records of breakdowns highlight how widespread the dependence had become. Women fainted in churches, screamed at servants, or burst into tears at social gatherings. They were described in newspapers as cases of nervous collapse, though the true cause was rarely named. Behind closed doors, families whispered about instability, never daring to connect the dots between the absence of therapy and the unravelling of sanity. To do so would have meant admitting what therapy had really been, and no one was prepared to strip away the veil of medical language that kept appearances intact. Doctors, too, faced dilemmas. Some recognized that patients deteriorated when therapy stopped, but they were unwilling to admit the underlying reason. To acknowledge dependence on orgasms would have exposed the hypocrisy of calling the practice medical. Instead, they wrote in medical notes about unresolved hysteria or degeneration of nerves. The language disguised the truth but could not erase the suffering it described. The women remained trapped, their bodies caught between denial and need, their lives unravelling as a result. The tragedy is most visible in cases where women were institutionalized. In asylums, the very symptoms that had once been treated with release were now suppressed with restraints, cold baths, or isolation. Women who had been kept sane by therapy were now driven further into despair without it. The institutions swelled with patients whose only crime had been dependence on a relief society refused to name. Their families visited less frequently, ashamed of the scandal, until the women disappeared into the silence of padded rooms and barred windows. Their lives became testimonies to the cruelty of repression disguised as morality. This collapse also revealed the power imbalance at the heart of the system. Women depended on doctors not just for treatment, but for survival. When those doctors withdrew their services, whether from fatigue, retirement, or moral hesitation, the women were left without choices. Their dependence exposed their vulnerability and, in many cases, destroyed their lives. It is a chilling reminder that even when society pretended to care for women's health, it cared more for appearances than for truth. I cannot help but think how terrifying it must have been to realize that one's sanity depended entirely on something that could be taken away without warning. What remained was a cycle of desperation. Some women turned to prayer, others to drink, and a few even to dangerous self-experiments in search of relief. But none of these carried the same power as the therapy that had been stolen from them. For many, the loss marked the beginning of a decline from which they never recovered. Their stories did not make headlines, for families preferred silence, but their absence in the record speaks loudly of lives erased by repression. The collapse of women deprived of therapy reveals the destructive consequences of denying the truth. They were not only patients, but human beings whose needs were never recognized as legitimate. By taking away the only outlet they had, society condemned them to madness, despair, and invisibility. The cost of silence was not abstract but measured in lives broken, families shattered, and voices erased. Victorian morality had insisted that purity was worth any sacrifice. For countless women, the sacrifice turned out to be their very sanity. Victorian society prided itself on control. Every element of a woman's life was carefully measured, restricted, and policed. Dresses were designed to shape the body into an ideal form. Speech was monitored to remain gentle and unprovocative, and laughter was only acceptable when delicate and restrained. A woman's footsteps were trained to glide quietly, her posture drilled into perfect stillness, and her emotions forced into silence. Manuals instructed her how to behave, sermons dictated how she should think, and gossip reminded her of what happened if she strayed. The aim was total order, a system so rigid that no space remained for the individual. Yet in the hidden spaces of the sick room and the physician's office, that order crumbled. For all their rules and restrictions, the one thing Victorian society could never fully control was the private surge of sensation within a woman's body. This contradiction was at the very heart of Victorian hypocrisy. Publicly, women were meant to be symbols of restraint, embodiments of purity so unshakable that even acknowledging their own flesh was considered indecent. Privately, however, the medical system was built upon the recognition that women's bodies demanded release. The culture denied sexuality while simultaneously creating entire industries to manage it. This paradox meant that women lived double lives: outwardly obedient, inwardly dependent on moments of ungoverned freedom. Every treatment session was a rebellion disguised as therapy. Every shuddering release a declaration of independence that society refused to name. It is almost absurd to think of a culture that banned open conversation about desire but quietly normalized mechanical devices designed to provoke it. The efforts at control were relentless. Husbands were taught that authority was theirs by divine right. Doctors were trained to write symptoms in neutral terms, disguising what they truly witnessed. Priests warned congregations against temptation, reminding women that curiosity about their own bodies was a sin. Even mothers instructed their daughters to avoid speaking or even thinking about desire. Yet despite all of this, women still discovered sensations that could not be silenced. The hypocrisy was written into every corner of life: purity enforced in public, while in private, women shook with uncontrollable release under the guise of medicine. For women, this discovery was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was the only moment they felt truly alive, their bodies acknowledged and their humanity affirmed. On the other hand, it tied their sense of self to secrecy and shame. They could not celebrate it, could not discuss it, and could not claim it as their own. It existed only in stolen fragments, framed as illness rather than vitality. Still, those fragments were powerful enough to plant seeds of quiet rebellion. Every hidden climax was proof that the body refused to submit entirely, that some part of a woman remained her own, no matter how tightly society tried to bind her. It reminds me of how even today, systems of control often fail because the human body and mind always find ways to resist. Historians now look back on these stories as evidence of the silent revolutions taking place under Victorian order. These were not rebellions marked by protests in the streets or declarations in Parliament. They were rebellions lived out in whispered societies, secret diaries, and the tremors of the body behind closed doors. Women who had no political power, no voice in public life, and no recognized autonomy found a form of resistance in the one place society could not touch. Their orgasms, disguised as therapy, were more than moments of relief. They were proof of an inner life that refused to vanish. The tragedy, of course, is that this freedom came at a cost. Because it was framed as hysteria treatment, women were never allowed to embrace their experiences as natural. They were made to feel broken, disordered, and dependent, when in truth they were simply human. The very thing that gave them life was weaponized against them as proof of weakness. Society managed to twist liberation into pathology, ensuring that even rebellion was folded back into the system of control. And yet, despite all efforts, the rebellion endured. Sensation continued, desire persisted, and the inner spark of life refused to be extinguished. I cannot help but feel both admiration and sorrow when I think of these women, whose most profound moments of humanity were forced into silence by the world around them. The final irony is stark. Victorian society could dictate clothing, behaviour, language, and morality, but it could never dictate the involuntary tremors of the body. Women might obey in every other aspect, but the climax of treatment remained untamed. This was the one truth that slipped through the cracks of morality, the one rebellion that needed no words, no banners, and no acknowledgement. It happened in silence, but silence did not make it less powerful. If anything, the secrecy made it stronger, a shared undercurrent running beneath the polished surface of Victorian life. By the end of the century, when devices had entered homes and secret societies had formed, it was clear that this hidden world had become inseparable from women's lives. Though unspoken, it shaped marriages, friendships, and entire communities. The obsession with control created its opposite, a culture of private rebellion, in which women clung to the one sensation that reminded them of their humanity. They were trained to suppress every trace of individuality, yet in the moments of release, individuality returned in force. The body declared what the mind could never say, that women were not passive ornaments, but living beings with needs, sensations, and strength. This is why the story of hysteria treatment is not merely about medical practice, but about survival. Women endured silence, shame, and endless judgment. Yet through this paradoxical therapy, they discovered something that society wanted to erase. They discovered themselves. The control imposed on them was vast, but it was never absolute. Beneath layers of lace and sermons, beyond the polished manners and whispered gossip, their bodies carried truths that no moral code could fully bury. Victorian society managed to bind women in countless ways, but it could not bind what surged from within. They could control the outer image, how women dressed, spoke, and behaved, but not the inner rebellion of sensation. That rebellion lived in silence, shaped a hidden culture of defiance that endured long after the era itself passed into history. And so the story closes, not with public revolution, but with private resilience. The women of the Victorian age may have been silenced in their parlours and controlled in their homes, but within them existed a force no system could erase. Their secret was not written in newspapers or spoken from pulpits, but it was lived in every hidden shiver, every forbidden release, and every quiet moment when they felt themselves to be fully alive. This was their rebellion, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. Thank you for staying with this journey into the contradictions of Victorian life, where purity was preached but rebellion lived in silence. May this story linger as a reminder of how resilience takes many forms, even in the most unlikely places. Good night, and may your rest be free, peaceful, and entirely your own.